Just as not learning the Vedic Indian parallels is a failure of diligence with regard to finding the source of many biblical stories, so also, as we will see, not learning the Gaelic myth of Diarmuid at minimum is a failure of diligence with regard to finding the source of the Adam and Eve narrative. The Diarmuid story is, of course, not the source of the Genesis story. But if we want to find the answer to this question, rather than merely maintaining a pretense of investigation, then the Diarmuid and Grainne story is absolutely required, as it is what enables us to reconstruct the most likely source of the Adam and Eve story. We are indeed forced by the data to go this route of triangulation and reconstruction via the Irish myth. And refusing to follow this necessity is merely a failure to pursue the evidence where it leads. While the story of Adam and Eve is traditionally viewed through a Near Eastern lens, the precise forbidden fruit sequence from the Adam and Eve story finds its closest structural parallel in Irish mythology, not in Persian, Indian, or even Near Eastern. Note that the forbidden food motif does have strong parallels also in the Iranic Masha and Mashan, as well as certain African folktales, each of which we will examine. But these are still less exact than the Irish story in the precise sequence of details shared with the Genesis sequence. As we will see, this surprising fact can be explained not by brushing it off as an oddity or reflexively assuming a borrowing, but by looking at the Indo-European nexus between the Irish Diarmuid/Dawn and the Iranic Yima/Jamshid. By fully mapping these parallels, we can hypothesize an earlier, likely Iranic version of this story form that best accounts for the tropes shared between the Diarmuid and Grainne and Adam and Eve stories. The forbidden fruit sequence, including the tempting, the origin of mortality, and the loss of divine favor. Even as the Iranic tradition emerges as the most likely source for the motif in the Adam and Eve story, we must remain conscious of the evidence we have seen thus far. The adapters who used Iranic material for the Hebrew Bible composition were aligned with or the same as the adapters who used the Indian material. Hence, it remains possible that Vedic material was also being cross-referenced or drawn from in less obvious ways for the composition of the Adam and Eve story too. And we will examine some of the possible points of intersection, or things that could have been part of the knowledge base in the background of the composition. The basis of the Indo-European Adam and Eve parallel can be structurally mapped by a set of equations as follows. Vedic Yama equals Iranic Yima/Jamshid. Vedic Yama/Iranic Yima equals Irish Down or Dawn. Irish Dawn equals Irish Diarmuid Dawn. Irish Diarmuid Dawn equals Iranic Yima. And lastly, the forbidden fruit sequence of the biblical Adam story is paralleled by the forbidden fruit sequence of Diarmuid's story. That this is not a borrowing of the biblical story into Irish myth can be demonstrated by the fact that Diarmuid parallels numerous motifs of Yima's mythos, while Yima and Yama parallel Adam independently in other motifs. Vedic Yama equals Iranic Yima/Jamshid. This is well established in scholarship and strongly supported linguistically and mythically. Yama and Yima come from the same root word meaning twin, and we also find Yima named Yam in Iranic material. Yama is the first mortal, while Yima is the first king. Yima is also called the first mortal with whom Ahura Mazda talked before Zarathustra in the Iranic scripture. Both father a lineage of humans and are tempted by their own sister into a taboo relationship, and in a conclusion that may or may not be connected to this, have a fall from divine favor resulting in the loss of immortality. The fathers of both Yima and Yama are also linguistic matches to one another. Yima, as we will see, also has a forbidden food of life that he makes use of against divine law. Vedic Yama, in particular, being the first mortal to die, is explicitly the god of the dead as well, and this carries over to his Irish parallel, dawn. Vedic Yama / Iranic Yima equals Irish dawn. This is a leading theory in Celtic comparative mythology. We might say one of the most agreed upon parallels in Irish comparative myth studies, where agreement on such things is rare. As Yama is the first divine being who becomes mortal and dies, becoming thereby the Lord of the dead, Eivir Dawn is the first of the sons of Mill to die upon approaching Ireland, and his body is taken to a southwestern isle, Tech Duin, where the dead are said to stop on their journey to the otherworld. Dawn's name means something like dark, supporting this role. Folklore contains various instances referencing Dawn as a lord of the fairy hills or sand mounds and to his slua, or host of the dead. See Traditions About Dawn by Kate Muller-Lisowski, citing the Handbook of Irish Folklore by Sean O'Sullivan. The destruction of Da Derga's hostel has the line, quote, "We ride the steeds of dawn, Tetskorach, from the elf mounds. Though we are alive, we are dead." Unquote. The scholar Kuno Meyer was one of the first to establish this parallel in the scholarship. In his 1919 article, Der Irische Totengott und die Toteninsel, quote, "After all this, I believe that it is possible to consider it to have been established that the pagan Gaels believed in their common descent from an ancestor, Dawn, who was also the death god, and whose dwelling was situated on an island to which all true Gaels came after their death. As ancestor and death god, Dawn is the exact counterpart of the Gaulish Dispater, who, according to Caesar, likewise combined both functions in himself. This belief in an ancestor and death god in one person is, however, not only common Celtic, but Indo-European, as the Indic Yama testifies." Unquote. From Meyer, 1919. John Carey cites this article in his excellent article, Dawn, African, Ith, and the Prehistory of Irish Pseudo-History, from 2010, and comments, quote, "Meyer, as we have seen, compared Dawn and the Gaulish Dispater with Yama in Indian mythology, also both god of the dead and ancestor of mankind." Unquote. And, quote, "The correspondence between the Irish and the Gaulish figures is indeed a striking one, and most scholars have accepted Meyer's interpretation of the evidence." Unquote. He further explains the meaning of Dawn's name, quote, "Dawn as well, the word's normal meaning is dark brown, but there are lingering traces of an earlier sense, black, dark, dusky, and the same range of senses can be found for its closest cognate, the rarer Welsh adjective duin. And we can further compare words like English dun and dusk, Latin fuscus, dark, and Sanskrit dusara, ash-colored. As Kate Muller-Lisowski pointed out, the Greek word davatos, death, may go back to an analogous euphemism. It appears to be related to such words as Sanskrit duanta, dark, Avestan duanman, cloud, and Latvian duans, vapor or smoke." Unquote. The Celtic scholars who cite this theory could be extended, and it is often taken for granted or mentioned in passing, as in Valérie Raidon in Le Dagda, Dieu de l'orage du Panthéon Irlandais, who uses Dawn's established alignment with Yama to distinguish the Dagda from these two. See Raidon, page 99. Broader comparative mythologists have followed suit in this general consensus. Jan Puvel, in his Comparative Mythology, takes it as established, stating, quote, "The death god Dawn, first of the Tua to die and the post-mortem receiver of mankind, has traits in common with the Vedic Yama." Unquote. From his Comparative Mythology, page 183. Bruce Lincoln continues this line, quote, "First king, he, Dawn, is also first to die, and upon his death he established the realm of the dead to which all his descendants venture when their time comes. In all this, he is strikingly similar to the Indian Yama." Unquote. From his Lord of the Dead, page 229. With this frame set, we can look at Diarmuid Dawn. Diarmuid, a hero of the Fenian cycle, is a continuation of this god Dawn. This claim is supported in the following evidence, but it can be cross-checked via the fact that Diarmuid and Donn both independently parallel portions of Yima/Jamshid's myths. If Donn parallels some of Yima/Jamshid's myths, while Diarmuid Donn parallels other of Yima/Jamshid's myths, then we can conclude that Diarmuid is likely a continuation of the Donn type, deriving from that archaic pool of connected myths. This can be verified by seeing how Diarmuid fits into the larger comparative picture and consistently maintains a Yima/Yama typology. The name Diarmuid then appears to be like an adjectival epithet of Donn, meaning unenvious. A key to the puzzle of how the story of Diarmuid and Grainne and that of Adam and Eve arrived where they are is the fact that, besides the Irish tale, the other Indo-European mythos that has a particularly strong parallel with Adam and Eve is that of the aforementioned Iranic equivalent of Diarmuid, Yima/Jamshid. The power of this triangulation becomes clear as we proceed. Yima, like Vedic Yama, gives in to the urging of his twin sister to father children by her. The golden age of his rule, with its divine favor and protection from death, ends when he speaks a false word. Vedic Yama similarly gives in to his sister Yami, loses immortality, accepts death in conjunction with this, and gains offspring instead, while Yima/Jamshid similarly gives in to his sister Jami. Other things have drawn scholars to note similarities between Yima and Adam. Yima marries a parig, a witch or demon, which scholars have compared to Adam's union with Lilith, from which union demons were born, and to the similar union between Eve and a male devil. See Zahner, page 31-32. We will find other connections to note as we go along. The Vedic Yama becomes the first mortal, the first to experience death, and thereafter the Lord of the Dead. In Rig Veda Book 10, hymn number 10, his tempting by his sister Yami to have a forbidden relationship is acted out in detail. His embrace of mortality to father children is found in Rig Veda 10.13.4. In the Avesta, in a separate event, Yima protects himself within a special enclosure, a vara, to survive a cataclysm, which will become important to the Diarmuid parallel. Donn is treated as a Lord of the Dead in Irish lore, and under the name Eivor Donn, he is the first to die as the sons of Mill approach Ireland. Being the first to die, he asks his men to take his body to a southwestern isle where the dead are said to stop on their way to the other world thereafter. Thus he forges the way to the land of the dead and becomes its patron lord in some respect. Next, the textual evidence points to Diarmuid being an extension of Donn. As R.A. Breatnach and Gerard Murphy argue, Diarmuid is an emanation of the god Donn. He is frequently called Diarmuid Donn, suggesting what the comparison of his tales to the Iranic Yima also supports, that he is an emanation or epithet of Donn. Like Yima, Diarmuid loses both sovereignty and life in a specific set of recognizable events. As R.A. Breatnach explains regarding Diarmuid being an aspect of Donn, quote, that Diarmuid originally was a deity is not open to doubt. He is to be identified with the well-known god Donn, the lord of the pagan Irish happy otherworld, of whom widespread traditions survive. The genealogists make him Mac Duin, Mac son of Donketh, Donkatha Donn. But this is invention. He is frequently called Diarmuid Donn, which, as I think, is only an inversion of Donn Diarmuid, meaning Donn the Unenvious. His surname, O'Jivnia, marks his association with the Corcu Jivnia, the Ernian people who gave their name to Corca Jivnia in West Kerry. Unquote. Gerard Murphy appears to agree with this assessment, saying, quote, it is noteworthy also that Donn was a god of the dead. See Kuno Meyer, the aforementioned article. And that Diarmuid, whose name means unenvious, is sometimes known as Diarmuid Donn, e.g. in Munster folklore, as on page 3 and 19 of the tale listed as Helper Tale 11, and in the literature of Ach na Senorach, edited by Stokes, 11, 1529, 3519, sometimes as Diarmad Mac Duin, or as Diarmad Duin, instances given by T.F. O'Rahilly. Cf. also Diarmad Ach Duin in a folk tale from the Dingle Peninsula, West Kerry, Diarmuid Mac Duin in a West Galway folktale, Du is the name of Diarmuid's father in the oldest literary reference to him, cf. Infra T.F. O'Rahilly, unquote. From Duanair Finn, The Book of the Lays of Finn, Part 3, by Gerard Murphy. As Yima and Yama parallel Adam as the first man or ruler who undergoes a temptation from his female twin-like counterpart, Eve being arguably twin-like to Adam due to physically splitting off of him, and who introduces death to the human line as a result, Diarmuid also mythically parallels Adam in this most crucial fashion. Diarmuid's wife makes him retrieve berries of extended life from a forbidden tree, and, even more, she does so at the urging of a third party. This taking of the forbidden fruit leads eventually to Diarmuid's capture and then death, and to a symbolic intrusion of death directly to his progeny. His wife miscarries triplets upon hearing of his death. Furthermore, Diarmuid acquires license to hunt without restriction throughout the forest wherein the forbidden fruit grows, and the tree of the berries of youth, or extended life, are the only thing forbidden to him and his wife there. This again is the identical dynamic that we find in the Adam and Eve story. Yahweh tells the pair that they may eat of anything in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil they may not eat. From Genesis 2, quote, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden, to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man," quote, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die," unquote. From Genesis 2, 15-16. And Genesis 3, 2-3, quote, "The woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die," unquote. In the pursuit of Diarmuid and Grainne, we are told similarly, quote, "When they were come into the forest, Diarmuid made a hunting booth in the very midst of the forest, and slew a wild deer that night, so that he and Grainne ate and drank their fill of flesh and pure water. Diarmuid rose early and went to the Sharvan Lachlanach, divine guardian of the forest, and made bonds of covenant and compact with him, and got from him license to hunt and to chase, provided that he would never meddle with his berries," unquote. As we should be able to see at a glance, the story of Diarmuid and the berries of the quicken tree of Dubros is arguably the closest narrative match to the Adam and Eve scene in world mythology. In Gilgamesh, for instance, the plant of immortality is stolen by a snake from the hero. In the Irish and Genesis versions, the hero takes or eats forbidden fruit at the urging of the wife, and does in fact eat it, but loses divine favor and dies later. The one key distinction to be made is that Eve takes the fruit herself and then urges Adam to take and eat some, while in Diarmuid and Grainne, Grainne urges Diarmuid to retrieve the berries from the tree and then they both eat of it. Nonetheless, the dynamic is as close as we find anywhere. No other story has the multi-step, specific forbidden fruit sequence that we find shared between these Irish and Genesis stories. This shared sequence is a forbidden fruit. Everything else in the area is permitted for them to eat but the forbidden fruit. The husband urged by a wife to eat or take the fruit. The wife tempted by a third party to do the urging. The third party tempter being arguably serpentine, the act leading directly to their capture and having to leave the forest/garden. This leaves them vulnerable to death and they die subsequently. The shared cause and effect chain is remarkable when it is all laid out. When Diarmuid takes the berries and they eat them, they give some to the nephews of Goll. The nephews of Goll take them back to Fionn, or Finn, who had sent them. He immediately scents Diarmuid's flesh on the berries and so is able to track him back to the forest. The link between Finn finding Diarmuid and Diarmuid having taken the berries is made clear. When Finn's men arrive, Diarmuid seeks refuge in the tree. Finn's men approach him there, and he has to fend them off until he finally leaps down. He is not killed right then, but this event does force him to leave the forest of Dubros, where the berries of life are, while Adam and Eve's apprehension right after eating the fruit leads to them being forced out of the garden, where the fruit of both life and knowledge of good and evil, are. Despite Diarmuid making a fragile truce with Finn, the events that subsequently unfold show that he has lost Finn's protection and good grace, as well as access to the berries of extended life, and this leads tragically to his death. When they are hunting together, Diarmuid is mortally wounded by a boar. Finn is urged to save him with magical healing water from his hands, but 3 times lets the water fall to the ground until it is too late. Diarmuid dies, ultimately a downstream effect of offending Finn, taking the berries, which lead to his being forced out of the forest of Dubros, leaving him exposed in the hostile world and now without the protective grace of Finn. When Diarmuid dies, Grainne miscarries triplets in a dramatic scene where they fall from her womb and off a rampart. This then appears to be a stark image of the entry of death directly into the progeny of Diarmuid. His children themselves become subsumed by the curse of death without divine reprieve. In one of his best-known stories, Yima builds a protective enclosure, the Vara or War, made at Ahura Mazda, the high god's command, to keep the creatures of the world alive during a cosmic winter. Yima hides in the Vara from the cosmic winter, but also from the pursuit of Azidahaka and Ahriman, who I argue parallel the nephews of Goll and Finn, respectively. Per Encyclopedia Iranica, quote, according to the Pazand Ayadgar I Zama Spig, Wi Wang Han had a pair of twins, Jam or Yima and Jami, and Jam took Jami with him when he went into exile. See the Persian Rivayats, page 580-81. According to the Pahlavi Rivayat, Jam and his sister Jamag go into the War in order to hide from mortal enemies and devs, or demons. Ahriman suggests he might be in the War, or Vara, unquote. In the forest called Doira an Beot, Diarmuid makes an enclosure with 7 doors of wattles, this reminding loosely of the specificity in the measurements of Yima's enclosure, in which Diarmuid protects himself from an attack of Finn and his men, until finally escaping. Quote, Diarmuid cut down the grove around him and made to it 7 doors of wattles, and he settled a bed of soft rushes and of the tops of the birch under Grainne in the very midst of that wood. And further along, quote, who else cut the wood thus, and made a close warm enclosure thereof, with 7 tight slender narrow doors to it, unquote. There is also a variant of Diarmuid and Grainne's enclosure episode in the Doira an Beot forest that seems another smoking gun for the claim that Diarmuid is a Yima parallel, and that these 2 similar hiding from Finn episodes parallel the hiding of Yima in his Vara from Azidahaka and from the cosmic winter. That is, in this variant tale, Diarmuid and Grainne hide out in a cave from what appears to them a cosmic winter. Yet, interestingly, due perhaps to the euhemerization, even though it is seemingly cosmic in scale, the cataclysmic winter storm that Diarmuid and Grainne wait out in their cave is revealed to them to have been an illusion of the hag goddess, the Cailleach, who is in the employ of Finn to make this illusory winter. The Cailleach is a cosmic goddess, though appearing humanized in the medieval legends per the standard practice, and so it seems reasonable to deduce that the song she sings to Diarmuid and Grainne about the cosmic winter, as they huddle in their cave, represents a sort of magical incantation that is weaving a magical reality. What the goddess does with magical incantation may be simultaneously a trick, an illusion, and a mythic reality. Underneath this story may be the older myth of the cosmic winter, now presented as a magical incantation and illusion of the winter-bringing goddess. The Cailleach shakes her cloak through the air as she sings of this quote-unquote illusory winter, while in Scottish folklore, when the Cailleach shakes her cloak through the air, it brings the snow of winter in actual fact. So this is the motion that magically creates the winter in the Celtic lore. As the Scottish folklorist F. Marion MacNeill records, quote, the Cailleach is the genius of winter and the enemy of growth. Her chief seat is Ben Nevis. She ushers in winter by washing her great plaid in the whirlpool of Corryvreckan, the cauldron of the plaid, Before the washing, it is said the roar of a coming tempest is heard by people on the coast for a distance of 20 miles, for a period of 3 days until the cauldron boils. When the washing is over, the plaid of old Scotland is virgin white." Unquote. McNeill, The Silver Bough, Volume 2, page 20. The glamour of the high goddess of winter may be divinely illusory, but to those under its spell, it is real. The effect of the cosmic winter myth comes through regardless. This is from The Hiding of the Hill of Howth, translated by Kuno Meyer. Quote, "I confess," said she, the Cailleach, "I never saw or heard the like of it for cold and storms, for the frost has spread over the hillocks, and there is not a smooth plain in all Elga, in which there is not a long rushing river between every 2 ridges," said she. "And no deer or raven in Erin finds shelter in a cave, or in any other place, or on an island, or in a bay of Falmag." Craftily she shook her raiment across the cave, and sang these staves. "Cold, cold, cold tonight is the broad plain of Lurg. Higher the snow than the mountain range. The deer cannot get at their food. Cold till doom. The storm has spread over all. A river is each furrow upon the slope, each ford a full pool," etc. Unquote. While nothing in this story makes explicit the fact that it is a sort of variant of the Doire do Boat enclosure episode, it shares certain odd details with that story, and so the 2 stories may have been regional variations on a theme, or perhaps they parallel the 2 different times Yima uses his vara for a place of protection aforementioned. The shared details are, first, that Diarmuid and Grainne are hiding out from Finn in both tales, and go inside an enclosed space, the enclosure of the forest and the cave of the hill. Finn is directly bearing down on them in both. Secondly, Angus Og appears miraculously in both stories to rescue them. In the case of the Doire do Boat enclosure, he rescues only Grainne, whisking her away and leaving Diarmuid to escape by using a bird-like leap. And in the case of the cave of the Hill of Howth, Angus appears right after the Cailleach finishes her winter song and helps them both escape on his magical boat, just beyond the reach of Finn in each case. We might consider that these could have been stock tropes of a kind, but precisely Angus doing such a rescue only appears in these 2 stories in this way, and is an odd detail to repeat in such similar contexts. Making it more odd, while the Hill of Howth cave story centers around the Cailleach singing of the cosmic winter as if enacting it there herself just before Angus arrives, the Doire do Boat story, while it has no Cailleach or Song of Winter, strangely makes note of the fact that when Angus speeds to the enclosure to help Diarmuid and Grainne, he goes there, quote, "accompanying the pure cold wind," unquote, all the way to the forest. Now, we could easily posit that Finn bearing down on Diarmuid and Grainne in the enclosure of Doire do Boat can himself symbolize the ruler of the cosmic winter in its divine masculine aspect, as opposed to the Cailleach as the feminine, since we also see Finn enlisting the Cailleach herself to make the magic winter song, in the same way that Enlil is the lord of the storm who drives on the cataclysmic flood in the Mesopotamian flood myth, where a hero hides in a boat from his stormy wrath. But the mention of the pure cold wind right at this moment appears like a shortened remnant of the Cailleach role from the other story, her divine presence and her song made into and minimized into the physical winter wind that is apparently blowing in the vicinity of the enclosure, and that the poet feels compelled to mention right here at this particular moment and nowhere else. Whether this detail is a coincidence or not, the set of similarities between the enclosure and cave stories allow us to say that Diarmuid is certainly the hero who waits out a sort of cosmic winter, as Yima does so centrally in his myth, and that Diarmuid has a strong case for being the hero who hides in the equivalent of Yima's vara in general. The Norse tradition suggests that the cosmic winter and enclosure motif was in Europe, and was attached to a severed head god as its keeper, as it is in, quote, Hodmimi's Holt, unquote, that the human couple Leaf and Leaf-Thrasir are kept safe during the cosmic Fimbulwinter, so that they can emerge to repopulate the world when it is over. Quote, What shall live of mankind when at last there comes the mighty winter to men? Vafthrûdnir spake. In Hodmimir's wood shall hide themselves Leaf and Leaf-Thrasir. Then the morning dews for meat shall they have, such food shall men then find. Unquote. From Vafthrûdnir's Mall, stanzas 44 and 45. As Hodmimi means Horde Mimir, and may just be a title of Mimir himself, as scholars believe, this suggestive detail was enough for Victor Riedberg to declare that Mimir was the Eddaic parallel of Yima. The holt or grove of Hodmimi also parallels well the grove of trees of Dwar da Bot, in which Diarmuid fashions his enclosure with 7 carefully made wattle doors. Next, just as Vedic Yama's house moves wherever he wishes, so also Diarmuid's house, when he is living with the sovereignty hag, can be moved wherever he wishes. Quote, The delightful assembly house, moving everywhere at the will of its owner, is of wide extent, unquote, from Mahabharata 2.8. Compare to the house that the hag materializes when Diarmuid wishes it. Quote, Where would you like to see the best house built that ever was built? She said. Up there on the hillside, if I had my choice, said he, and with that he fell asleep. And in the morning 2 men of the Fianna came in, and they said they were after seeing a great house up on the hill, where there was not a house before. Unquote. According to the Fars Nama, Yima/Jamshid hid inside a tree. Diarmuid and Grainne hide in the top in the foliage of the quicken tree, where they are discovered by Finn McCool. Diarmuid's eventual death follows as a delayed upshot of his finding in the tree, since it causes Diarmuid to have to leave the safety of the forest of Dubros. As Encyclopedia Iranica notes, quote, In the Shah Nama, after 100 years of hiding, Jamshid appeared one day in Chin, on the shore of the ocean, that is China. Here Zahak found him and sawed him apart. According to the Fars Nama and a poem on Jamshid among the Persian Rivayats, he was killed in China, in a forest where he had hidden inside a tree, according to the Rivayat, by the ocean, according to the Fars Nama. Satan then told Bivarasp, that is Zahak, where Jamshid was hidden, and he began sawing the tree. When he sawed through Jamshid's body, the sun disappeared, but when they returned the next day, he was again whole. This happened once more before they were able to kill him. The fall in Yima and Diarmuid's myths is also subsequent to a triple failure, a triple event of false speech in both cases. In Yasht 19, the Kavarena, the fortune/sovereign glory, leaves Yima in 3 portions after he utters a lie, or utters 3 lies. As Encyclopedia Iranica explains, quote, In Yasht 19.30 through 34, the wanderings of the fortune, the Kvarena, are described, and in particular, how it left Yima in the shape of the Varaina bird when he uttered a, quote, deceiving word, Dreogam Vachim. Yima's lie is mentioned only once in Yasht 19, before the description of the 3 departures of the fortune, and it is not clear whether it left each time on account of a new lie, as assumed by Christensen 1918 through 34, whether it departed 3 times, thus Christensen 1931, Humbach and Ikaporia, also Kellens, or whether it departed in 3 portions, thus Bartholomew, etc. Unquote. Like Yima, Diarmuid crucially loses a symbol of sovereignty by speaking falsely 3 times. An ugly hag comes to Diarmuid one night and he allows her into his bed. When they awake, she is a beautiful maiden. She makes him promise to never mention how she was an ugly hag when she first came to him. If he breaks this vow, this magical taboo, she will leave him forever. When she gives away 3 of Diarmuid's dogs in successive events while he is away from home, Diarmuid angrily and presumptuously reminds her of how ugly she was when she first arrived, 3 times in succession, breaking his vow. When he does so the third time, she disappears, and he must search for her in the land under wave, where he finds her sick unto death. Although he retrieves 3 drops of her blood that he is told will heal her when she drinks them, she informs him, and he realizes that he no longer loves her, and they part permanently. Quote, "O Diarmuid," she said, "your love is gone from me." "Oh, it is gone indeed," said he. And as to Diarmuid, he would take no reward, and he would not stop there, but he asked for a ship to bring him home to Ireland, to Finn and the Fianna. Unquote. The hag, especially one who sleeps with a hero, is a standard symbol of sovereignty, or the divine favor that underlies sovereignty in Celtic lore. This is so much the case that the sovereignty hag has become a near ubiquitous concept every student of Celtic myth learns on day 1 of the introductory class. This is well summarized by Tawusi Malik, who says, quote, "In Irish tradition, it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of this idea of the land and its sovereignty conceived in the form of a woman." From Masha, Celtic Mythology, London, 1969, page 92. James MacKillop explains, quote, "Stories of a king's or a potential king's lovemaking with the goddess of sovereignty are so widespread in early Ireland and elsewhere in Europe, such as Geoffrey Chaucer's The Wife of Bath's Tale, as to merit their own international folk motif number D732. According to the conventionalized steps in the story, the male protagonist encounters an ugly hag who invites him to have intimate relations with her. Her repulsiveness initially puts him off, but he eventually relents. One morning after their lovemaking, the hag is transformed into a beautiful maiden." Unquote. From James MacKillop, A Dictionary of Celtic Mythology, see Sovereignty Lady. Wikipedia elaborates, quote, "The type text for the idea of the sovereignty goddess is the medieval Irish Ectra Mac Nechach, The Adventures of the Sons of Yochi, in which a hideously ugly woman offers the young men water in return for a kiss. Only Niall kisses her with conviction, and moreover has sex with her, whereupon the woman becomes beautiful and utters the verse, quote, 'King of Tara, I am the sovereignty. I will tell you its great benefit. It will belong to your descendants forever, above every kindred. That is the true reason for which I speak.' Unquote. See also Victoria Simmons' Sovereignty Myth in Celtic Culture, a Historical Encyclopedia, edited by John T. Koch. Tawusi Malik, Aspects of the Theme of King and Goddess in Irish Literature, Etudes Celtiques, and also Georges Dumézil, The Destiny of the King, and Ananda Kumaraswamy, On the Loathly Bride. So if the hag of Diarmuid is the hag of sovereignty and divine favor, then he loses this sovereignty by breaking his word, speaking falsely, and with a touch of arrogant hubris 3 successive times. This matches exactly the sovereign glory, the kvarena, that Yima loses in 3 portions due to speaking falsely. While the sovereignty is embodied as a hag wife in Diarmuid's story, it is pictured as a divine bird in the story of Yima, which flies away in 3 portions and goes elsewhere. Diarmuid's 3rd and final broken word is described as follows, quote, "There was great anger on him then, when he saw all the pups gone. And he said the 3rd time, 'If this woman remembered the way she was when I found her, and her hair down to her heels, she would not have let the pup go.' 'Oh, Diarmuid, what is it you are after saying?' she said. He asked forgiveness of her then, and he thought to go into the house, but it was gone, and the woman was gone on the moment, and it was on the bare ground he awoke on the morrow. There was great sorrow on him then, and he said he would search in every place till he would find her again." Unquote. From The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grainne. Yima's reign is one in which there is no death or disease. This state lasts as long as Yima rules, and thus, when his reign ends, these things enter the world of humans. There is an implied fall into mortality at the end of Yima's golden age. As Yasna 9.4-5 says of Yima, quote, "He made from his authority both herds and people free from dying, both plants and waters free from drought, and men could eat inexhaustible food. In the reign of brave Yima was there neither cold nor heat. There was neither age nor death, nor envy demon-made. Like teenagers walked the two forth, son and father, in their stature and their form, so long as Yima, son of Vivangvant, ruled, he of the many herds." Unquote. This state then compares generally to the Edenic state of Adam and Eve, while being different in obvious ways. Jamshid, or Yima, and Diarmuid both wander in the wilds in an exile while being pursued. From Encyclopedia Iranica, quote, "Having lost his divine fortune, Jamshid was deposed by Zahak and took to the mountains and deserts. According to Bal Ami, Jamshid was at Damavand when Bivarasp, that is Zahak, came looking for him." Unquote. The parallel between Yima and Adam has been commented on by scholars for a century at least. James Hope Moulton focused on the parallels between the Old Testament and the Avestan stories about how sin, death, and misery entered the world. See Moulton's work from 1913, page 148 through 50. Citing Yasna 32.8 and the Pahlavi translation of Yasna 9.1 from Bartholomew, etc., he concluded that Yima, deceived by the Devas, who deprive men of good life and immortality, had made his subjects immortal by giving them forbidden food to eat. He pointed out that the similarities in the two stories, the spirit of evil was materialized as a serpent, and the consequence of the fall was the loss of the divine glory, but also the differences. Yima, a man, gave forbidden food, that is meat, to his subjects, while Eve, a woman, gave a fruit to her husband. Quote, "If my interpretation of an obscure text is right, we could say that in both religions the primeval parent sinned by giving forbidden food which should bring immortality, and that the sin was committed through the deceit of a demon power. In both again we have the spirit of evil materialized as a serpent. We may pass over the absence of Azi Dahaka from the fall story, which is of course but a fragment. And in both the consequence of the fall is the loss of the divine glory. Put in this way, the resemblance is so striking that we should assume dependence to be inevitable. But mark the differences. In the Avesta, it is a king who gives forbidden food to his subjects. In the former, the Avesta, the food is beef. In the latter, the fruit of a tree. Moreover, Yima has lost his pride of place long before the Avestan story took its form. He was only in the 5th generation of mankind." Unquote. From William Hope Moulton, Early Zoroastrianism, page 307 to 308. Albert Carnoy, in the same era, noted that, quote, "A late book, on the other hand, relates that Yima unwittingly gave meat to a deva, although the most current form of the legend is that Yima, in his mind, began to dwell on words of falsehood and of untruth." Unquote. From Albert Carnoy, The Mythology of All Races, Volume 6, Iranian Mythology, page 310. The version where Yima unwittingly gives the meat to a demonic deva can remind us of the fact that Diarmuid, in fact, gives the stolen fruit to the nephews of Goll, who parallel the serpent figures of Iran and Genesis, arguably. In the Irish tradition, Diarmuid dies because Finn McCool refuses to give him a drink of healing water when he is mortally wounded. This is similar to the other origin of death folklore, where immortality is lost at the last minute, or in a near miss of some kind, and we will return to the archaic origin of death motifs found throughout Diarmuid's mythos in the conclusion. Jamshid, that is Yima, is tricked into a relationship with a king's daughter, as Diarmuid is similarly tricked into a relationship with a king's daughter, Grainne, leading to his exile. Encyclopedia Iranica notes, quote, "Jamshid came to Zabolestan, where he stayed for 20 years. There the king's daughter tricked him into marrying her." The Majmal al-Tawarik, page 25, gives the name of the princess as Uparicara. Unquote. Yama resists Yami, his sister, in their dialogue hymn of Rigveda Book 10, while, as aforesaid, Yima is tricked at least by the king's daughter. Diarmuid, like Yama, resists the female temptress at first, before succumbing to her magical compulsion. Quote, "Wilt thou receive courtship from me, O Ojivnia, since Oshin received it not from me?" "I will not," said Diarmuid, "for whatever woman is betrothed to Oshin, I may not take her, even were she not betrothed to Finn." Then said Grainne, "I put thee under taboos of danger and of destruction, O Diarmuid, that is, under the taboos of mighty druidism, if thou take me not with thee out of this household tonight." Unquote. from The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grainne. Carnoy puts a fine point on the overlap of Yima and his sister Yimak or Jamag with Masha and Mashan, also pointing out a legend connecting Yima to the invention of wine and a woman who develops an urgent need to drink a wine that she at first thinks is poison, resembling the urgent need of Grainne to drink the terribly forbidden fruit. Quote, "The story of Yima and Yama is closely related to that of the twins Yama Yami or Yima Yimak, who after much hesitation agree to have intercourse with one another and become the parents of mankind. In Iran, the tradition is a doublet of the legend of Masha and Mashan, in which similar hesitations occur," unquote, writes Carnoy. Yima, quote, "was supposed to have discovered wine. Merkhond tells an anecdote about this. Having tried the taste of the juice of grapes, the king observed a sensation of bitterness and conceived aversion for it, thinking that it was a deadly poison. A damsel of the palace, seized with violent pain in her head, longed for death and accordingly resolved to drink of the juice that was deemed poisonous. She did not die, however, but drank so much of it that she fell into a beneficent sleep, which lasted an entire day and night. On awaking, she found herself restored to perfect health, and for this reason the monarch ordered the general use of wine," unquote. From Albert Carnoy, The Mythology of All Races, Volume 6, Iranian Mythology, pages 316 and 319. The points shared between the Indo-Iranic Yama/Yima and the Gaelic Diarmuid thus should be specified to distinguish them from the motifs found with Adam and Eve. 1. Yima/Jamshid loses the glow of sovereignty, Kvarena, in a three-part way due to telling one or three lies. Diarmuid loses the hag wife, traditional symbol of sovereignty, due to breaking his promise to her 3 times. 2. Yima/Jamshid is tricked by a king's daughter into running away with him. Diarmuid is magically compelled by a king's daughter into running away with him. 3. Yima builds an enclosure with special measurements to hide out during a cataclysm and during Azidahaka's pursuit. Diarmuid builds or stays in an enclosure to hide out from the Cailleach's cosmic winter and from Finn's pursuit. 4. Azidahaka, emissary of Ahriman, pursues Yima/Jamshid. The nephews of Goll, emissaries of Finn, pursue Diarmuid. 5. Azidahaka is serpentine. We can deduce that Goll and Finn may have had a serpentine form speculatively via internal analysis of Irish lore and via parallels to Odin and Rudra. 6. Yima gives forbidden meat of extended life to his people, while also discovering outwardly poisonous wine via a woman's urgent need. Diarmuid takes the forbidden berries of extended life due to Grainne's urgent need, giving some to Grainne and the nephews of Goll. 7. Yima/Jamshid is caught hiding in a tree. Diarmuid is caught hiding up in a tree. 8. This leads to his death, and this leads to his death. 9. Yima/Jamshid wanders in mountains and deserts in exile after losing his status. Diarmuid wanders in forests in exile after losing his status. 10. Yama resists at first, but ultimately gives in to the female proposition, leading to mortality. Diarmuid resists at first, but ultimately gives in to the female proposition, leading to mortality. Any similarity found in Celtic lore to the Bible can be, and is, reflexively written off as late Christian borrowing. Against this unthinking reflex, it has to be insisted. The details of the comparative data in the present case make Christian borrowing unlikely when closely examined. In cases like this, the bird's eye view of the totality of the data actually makes the superficially simpler explanation, borrowing, look like the more implausible one, indeed the more fantastical. Hidden complexities have not been taken into account by such a borrowing theory. To believe in borrowing in such a case, one would have to believe a medieval monk was a secret genius of comparative Indo-European mythology. But as a general principle, and barring incredible evidence to the contrary, we can say that the ancients did not play reverse operation in the dark. In the game Operation, the player is trying to remove individual organs from a body, and if they touch the sides, the buzzer goes off. Given that Diarmuid has Yima as his extensive Iranic parallel, to play reverse operation in this case would mean trying to insert a complex organ the Adam and Eve forbidden fruit sequence into a body, Irish mythology as a whole, without causing any comparative misfitting. To miraculously win reverse operation would be to place the forbidden fruit borrowing into a story or mythos whose other elements end up perfectly fitting with the mythos of the equivalent Iranic parallel. Because the forbidden food motif is found in the Diarmuid and Grainne story, the hero who is the quote-unquote correct parallel to Yima/Yama, for borrowing to have caused this placement would require that the game of reverse operation, placing the forbidden food motif into the correct story without a seam, was played flawlessly by a textual surgeon beyond comprehension. That is, of course, if we insist it to be a borrowing. However, not only does the forbidden food mythic slot of the Diarmuid story align so well with that of Yima, along with the other shared motifs between them, but the reverse operation player in this hypothetical, the Christian borrower, would have had no way of even knowing the Iranic Yima type motifs to identify Diarmuid as the correct destination for the forbidden food motif. He would not have been aware that Diarmuid was a Yima type at all, or that the Yima type hero, Diarmuid, was the one for whom it is fitting to also have a forbidden food of long life. In short, not only would he have to flawlessly perform the transplantation surgery of this game of reverse operation, he would have to have played it entirely in the dark, in terms of comparative myth and what it can tell us in terms of identifying the parallel of Yima within the Irish mythic corpus. Clearly, we are pushing well into absurdity in this hypothetical. Hence, the ancients did not play reverse operation in the dark. They were not even attempting such a game, which is only a figment of our hypothetical fantasy. If Diarmuid has a forbidden food story, it is far more simply and coherently explained as coming from the same root of inheritance as his Indo-European cousin Yima's forbidden meat, and to conclude that the meat and fruit simply diverged at some point. If the 7 points shared between Diarmuid and Yima/Yama, but not shared with Adam and Eve, are the pre-existing body, then the forbidden fruit sequence is the 8th, 9th, and 10th pieces that the borrower supposedly transplants with uncanny perfection from the Bible. The blind surgeon paradox, or playing reverse operation in the dark, is this. To believe in borrowing, you have to believe the monk took that one piece, the fruit sequence, and while playing in the dark of comparative mythological ignorance, successfully snapped it into the one specific region of the body of Irish myth, Diarmuid, that already had the correct 7 invisible Yima-type slots waiting for it. If the borrower puts the fruit in any other story, it is a mess, or at least jars with the comparative picture in a noticeable way. But because it snaps perfectly into the Diarmuid/Yima skeleton, the borrowing theory requires a miracle of blind accuracy. To restate concisely, Diarmuid has many of the other Yima-type motifs, and these show he is the correct parallel of Yima already. This can be established, first of all. Therefore, the inclusion of the forbidden fruit story in the Diarmuid story implies either that a borrower played reverse operation in the dark, or that the forbidden fruit sequence in the Diarmuid story comes from the shared Indo-European root. Reverse operation in the dark is absurd and impossible. Therefore, the evidence points to the latter, the shared Indo-European root. In sum, the fact that the Irish story has the Adam and Eve-like forbidden fruit sequence plus the recognizable Yima-type portions that the Bible lacks, is the smoking gun. The Diarmuid and Grainne story is embedded in the Fenian cycle on multiple levels, with other story threads all weaving into it smoothly. This situation suggests a further logical contradiction in the skeptic's position, an inconsistent borrower. If a medieval Irish scribe intended to Christianize a pagan hero by grafting the Adam and Eve story, or at least a sequence from it, onto Diarmuid, it would be reasonable to presume their primary goal would be to teach or support established teachings, to convey the orthodoxy-approved theological core in a way that would accomplish the pedagogical aim that a borrowing of Bible stories usually implies. If so much effort were taken to surgically weave the forbidden fruit sequence into the Fenian cycle, it is reasonable to think that the process was intended to bring the pagan mythos into line with the Christian doctrine, in a clear enough way that the audience would recognize the moral contained in the biblical story. If one goes to the immense trouble of perfectly importing the structural sequence of the fall, with the wife's urging, the forbidden fruit in a place where everything else is permitted to take, and the third party, arguably serpent-related, tempter, only to then change the names, swap the fruit, an apple in the received tradition from the Latin Vulgate, for quicken berries, replace the serpent with a set of brothers, and bury the theology in a longer complex saga of a triply lost sovereignty, a king's daughter, and a love-spotted hero, while also positioning the forbidden fruit scene late in a long sequence of pursuits between one god hero and another, rather than as something the very first humans did. If one carefully borrows yet changes this much, seemingly at random, the presumed purpose of borrowing in the first place appears to be defeated. To argue for borrowing is to suggest that these scribes were playing reverse operation in the dark and then defacing their immense efforts beyond recognition, carefully stitching in a biblical story and then immediately camouflaging it so that it required 21st century comparative mythology data to decode. To what purpose? We can then presume that, unless special evidence shows otherwise, the ancients would not simultaneously borrow and conceal in this way. The differences in the Diarmuid and Grainne forbidden fruit sequence, even Grainne being pregnant and making Diarmuid be the one to get the fruit, are unexplained in such a theory. If a scribe wanted Diarmuid to be a new Adam, he could have called him Adam, or at least used the famous iconography of the garden, made it clear that they were the first humans introducing sin or death, or demonstrated that they were conveying any of the orthodox theology. Instead, what we find in the Diarmuid story is a narrative that is cryptic from a Christian perspective, but perfectly transparent from an Indo-European one. The Irish forbidden fruit sequence is fleshed out and complex, and has no signs of being an abstracted patch-in. Instead, the Diarmuid and Grainne story as a whole preserves more identifiably ancient motifs than the much shorter story of Adam and Eve does, not fewer. Furthermore, because the forbidden food motif found in Diarmuid's story fits with the Iranic equivalent so plainly, and both are of the same broader type, this means that the story of Diarmuid, of all stories in Celtic myth, would be the one most likely to already have had a forbidden food motif, to match Yima. That is, would be the most likely place where such a borrowing would have been redundant, and thus, in this regard, is the least likely place where the forbidden food motif would be a borrowing. In short, all arrows point to the forbidden fruit being a native inheritance in the Diarmuid and Grainne mythos and not a biblical borrowing. Finally, the theological differences from Genesis found in the Diarmuid and Grainne story are so deep that they appear unlikely to be superficial elaborations by a Christian composer. In Genesis, the fall is overtly a moral catastrophe for all humanity. In the Diarmuid story, the berry theft is a specific, heroic, ordinance-breaking event, but its costs are not at all immediately clear. Diarmuid is found by Finn as a result, but he escapes again, and then they have a truce for a while, and only in the extended finale of the story does Diarmuid suffer death due to how deeply he has offended Finn. When Finn, who is in the role matching Yahweh, fails to overcome his grudge in order to heal Diarmuid from a mortal wound. This grudge is not even about the berry taking. The berry taking only allowed Finn to track and catch up to Diarmuid at one point, but the grudge was about the wife Finn felt Diarmuid stole from him earlier on. The theology in the story of Diarmuid and Grainne is not at all a thin Christian veneer, and would egregiously miss the point of Christian theology if it was attempting to be such a veneer. Instead, an entirely different and more lengthy set of deeply Celtic pagan taboo-based laws and honor obligations are being illustrated. These have deep roots that are unlikely to be faked, and are arguably even at cross purposes with Christian moral lessons. These are woven into the forbidden fruit sequence, which serves as a pivotal causation point in the climax of the tragic saga. Due to the fact that the Diarmuid and Grainne story requires this much decoding to find the Adam and Eve parallel, it is far more likely that they relate via a shared archaic root than via a direct borrowing. A final point detracts from the idea that the Diarmuid and Grainne forbidden fruit sequence was in any way taken from the Adam and Eve story by Christians. The tree of the berries in Diarmuid's story is guarded by Sharvan Lachlanach, a giant said to be of the, quote, children of wicked Cam or Ham, son of Noah, unquote. This suggests an entirely different Christian overlay has been added on to the Diarmuid story, placing Diarmuid far down the chronology, far after the time of Adam, and underlining the probability that Diarmuid is not being equated with Adam whatsoever by the scribes. That is, there is a clear Christian layer, or attempt to weave the Diarmuid story into Christian chronology, but instead of the Christian scribe making Diarmuid into Adam, he strongly distances this particular forbidden fruit event from Adam, as if saying this event happened far after Adam and should not be compared to it. This is extremely contradictory and hard to explain if the Christian compiler was borrowing directly from the Adam story for any purpose of Christian theology. In conclusion, none of this makes sense as a borrowing, and those who wish to hand-wave it as a borrowing have a lot on their plates to explain, things much more easily explained by looking to the nexus from which the Celtic and Iranic stories both derive. A variant of the Diarmuid and Grainne forbidden fruit story exists elsewhere in the Gaelic tradition as well. Delgnat, the wife of the pseudo-historical founder figure Parhalon, has an affair with a servant. They drink from the forbidden wine of Parhalon, and Parhalon detects that they have done so by the same mechanism that Finn detects that the hand of Diarmuid has touched the stolen berries. Parhalon scents that the lips of the pair have touched the drinking tube of the wine, as Finn smells that the flesh of Diarmuid has touched the berries. Furthermore, Parhalon has 4 unusually named sons, Orba, Fergana, and Feron. These are identical to 4 named sons of Eivor Finn in the Sons of Meal account told in a separate section of the Laur Gawala Erin, Orba, Fergana, and Feron. Parhalon also loses one eye when he attacks his parents before fleeing from them to Ireland. The attack on the parents is a quintessential Rudra-type motif, as when Rudra attacks his father Prajapati or Cronus attacks his father Uranos, and the one eye is the most blatant sign that we are dealing with the same god once again, the one-eyed god of wisdom, also known as Fintan/Goll, and Finn. Sharing the same 4 son names and the same complex mytheme, complete with a specific detection mechanism, puts the equivalence between Parhalon's forbidden wine and the forbidden Dubros berries beyond reasonable doubt. As story sequences, they are variants of one another within the Irish tradition, deriving from a shared source. This suggests the deep embeddedness of this story type in the Gaelic tradition, and provides us with a second instance of the Gaelic forbidden fruit story type being used in a context that is counterintuitive if it is assumed as a borrowing from Genesis. These are not the first humans, once again, and if anything, Parhalon is the culture hero driving the story, while his wife and servant are a notable aside in Parhalon's settlement narrative, with numerous details that once again are a mismatch to the Genesis sequence and are tied into Gaelic honor codes and laws. Quote, Parhalon, who was a man of knowledge, had a vat of most sweet ale, out of which none could drink aught, save through a tube of red gold. Thirst seized them after the deed, Topa and Delgnat, according to truth, so that their 2 mouths drank, their 2 drinks in the tube. When they did it, a couple without remorse, there came upon them very great thirst. Soon they drank a bright cauldron through the gilded tube. Parhalon arrived outside, after ranging the wilderness. There were given to him, it was a slight disturbance, his vat and his tube. When he took the straight tube, he perceived upon it at once the taste of Topa's mouth as far as this, and the taste of Delgnat's mouth. A black, surly demon revealed the bad, false, unpleasant deed. Here is the taste of Topa's mouth, said he, and the taste of Delgnat's mouth. Then said the sound son of Serah, the man called Parhalon, though short the time we are outside, we have the right to complain of you. The man smote the woman's dog with his palm. It was no profit. He slew the hound. It was a treasure that would be slender. So that is the first jealousy of Ireland. Delgnat answered her husband, Not upon us is the blame, though bitter thou thinkest my saying it. Truly, but it is upon thee. Though evil thou thinkest my saying it to thee, Parhalon, its right shall be mine. I am the one before one here. I am innocent. Recompense is my due. Honey with a woman, milk with a cat, food with one generous, meat with a child, a right within an edged tool. One before one, 'tis a great risk. The woman will taste the thick honey, the cat will drink the milk, the generous will bestow the pure food, the child will eat the meat. The right will lay hold of a tool, the one with the one will go together, wherefore it is right to guard them well from the beginning. That is the first adultery to be heard of made here in the beginning, the wife of Parhalon, a man of rank, to go to an ignoble henchman. He came after the henchman, and slew him with anger. To him there came not the help of God, upon the ware of the kin-murder. The place where that was done, after its fashioning certainty, great is its sweetness, that there was there of a day in the land of Innis Cimera. And that, without deceit, is the first judgment in Ireland, so that thence, with very noble judgment, is, quote, the right of his wife against Parhalon, unquote, unquote. From Laur Gawala Aaron, Parhalonians. There is another very Diarmuid-like story in the Gaelic material, and that is the story of Fóhath Canaine. Finn marries a woman, Bathamar. Curach had killed her foster brother. Finn goes to take him, but Curach beheads the wife of Finn. Finn beheads Curach. Fóhath Canaine, son of Lugith, is the brother of Curach, and so lies in wait of Finn, but they make peace. Finn invites Fóhath to an ale feast. Fóhath has a taboo that he cannot feast without the presence of dead heads. There is a law in the land against killing, except in certain places like the Paps of Anu. Finn goes to the Paps of Anu to kill someone to collect dead heads for Fóhath's taboo. Fóhath's sister Tait and her husband Finn Regaman are planning to go to drink at the feast and so pass by Finn at the Paps of Anu. Finn's man throws a spear at them as they pass. The spear goes through the woman first and into her husband. As they are dying, the husband blames his wife for the mortal wound, since the spear came to him through her. He also describes it as a cold blast that has come to him. She scolds him for this blind charge, and they die. Fóhath and Finn are set in their feud thereafter. In a separate tale, Fóhath woos the wife of the Fianna leader Ailill Flann Beck. She goes to a tryst with him, and Fóhath carries her off. Ailill Flann Beck pursues them and fights a battle with Fóhath. Fóhath is beheaded. The wife carries his head to a grave, and it sings a song to her, a singing severed head. Since Fóhath steals away someone's wife, and this leads to his becoming a singing severed head, while also being in a complex feud with Finn, and furthermore, having a death god-like taboo where he has to have dead heads present in order to feast, we are forced to consider that Fóhath could be another variant of Diarmuid Dawn, perhaps from another region's tradition originally. In this context, we can focus in on the sister of Fóhath, who is killed along with her husband. Notice precisely what the wife says to the husband just before they are killed. Quote, "Let us go," said Tait, daughter of Macneath, sister of Fóhath. "The ale feast which Finn is preparing for my brother shall be for us. Let us go drink it," said she to her husband. Unquote. The "let us go drink it" indicating Finn's ale matches well to Delgnat and her servant Topa drinking Parhalon's wine. It is this suggestion of the wife to go drink Finn's ale that leads, by misfortune, directly to the death of her husband and herself. From this perspective, their death scene even seems like a comic parody of the blame that the woman often gets in this tale type, as the spear enters the husband from the direction of the wife, and thus she gets his blame. Eve offers Adam the fruit that leads to eviction and death. Grainne demands Diarmuid take the berries that lead to eviction from the forest. And Finn Regaman is killed by a spear passing from his wife Tait's body into his. Quote, "Finn's man sent a cast after them, so that it was in the breast of the man after having gone through the woman first. They both died. It seemed to the man, however, that it was the woman who had wounded him, and he said, 'A cold blast, the blast that has come to me from thee, O woman,' etc. 'Blindly thou chargest me,' saith the woman." Unquote. This humorous framing allows us to see just how much the woman is merely a passageway for the death working of Finn and his man, even if she is bound to take the blame, as Grainne is likewise merely a go-between in the death working enacted by Finn and the nephews of Goll, or Eve is of the serpent. The death blow being called a quote-unquote cold blast also reminds us, perhaps coincidentally, of the cold wind the Cailleach sings of to Diarmuid and Grainne, as if this death and the cosmic winter that had been avoided previously are symbolically being united, as finally breaking through the protective barriers of this hero who is being introduced here to death. Thus, Finn mac Regaman, this husband who is killed, and Fóhath, who sets off the events and becomes the singing severed head, can arguably both be taking part of the overall Diarmuid/Yima mythos in this particular version of things. So if the forbidden fruit motif in Diarmuid and Grainne's story is an authentic Celtic version of an Indo-European myth, organically embedded in the precisely proper Yima-type mythos of Diarmuid, then where exactly should we deduce the Genesis usage of this motif actually came from? Clearly, based on our preceding analysis, there was an extensive project to adapt Indian and Persian myths into the stories of the patriarchs of Genesis and Exodus, at least from Abraham to Moses. The preponderance of identifiable motifs thus far has seemed to actually be from Indian sources. However, the Vedic Yama has no clear forbidden fruit motif. It is true that in the Rig Veda, he is described as being in a tree clothed with leaves and drinking with the gods. See Rig Veda 10.35.1. Though this sounds like a description of his afterlife domain, perhaps. And it is true that Yama is tempted by his female other half to break a terrible taboo, to indulge in the quote-unquote forbidden fruit of a sexual relationship with her, in Rig Veda 10.10, and that he ultimately gives up immortality for the path of mortal death in order to father children. Some of these Vedic themes could theoretically be in the background of the Adam and Eve story, via the general Indo-Iranic adaptation process, if the adapters had awareness of Vedic Yama as well. But there is no actual forbidden food in surviving stories of Yama, and no evidence pointing toward any lost version of this motif in his Indian evidence. The possibly derived legend of Vasu Uparicara will be considered shortly as counterpoint. We also can only go on what has survived, so it is possible there could have been a lost Indian myth being accessed by the biblical adapters in this case, but much more points in the Iranic direction for now. Varuna has an important myth about the gods eating his forbidden barley and being cursed with death and disease, found in Shatapatha Brahmana 2.5.2.1-4. Quote, Prajapati produced living beings. The beings produced by him ate Varuna's barley corn. Varuna seized them, and on being seized by Varuna, they became rent all over. The outbreathing and the inbreathing forsook them not, and owing to these two, the creatures did not perish. Prajapati healed them by means of that oblation. Unquote. The noose of Varuna here represents death, and although the creatures do not perish, they would die if Prajapati did not magically release them from this doom. This appears to be a myth of similar type, then, that fills a similar role to the Yima forbidden food of the Vedics, if not precisely the same. Other than death mysteriously existing alongside Prajapati in the beginning in some myths of Prajapati, there is also a clear origin of death myth in the Vedic corpus, albeit not clearly connected to a forbidden food. Brahma, seeing the runaway overpopulation of the world he created, wishes to destroy it in fire. Shiva, out of mercy for the world, proposes the introduction of death to end the miserable state of the world, and proposes also the rhythmic cycle of rebirth as a second expression of his grace toward living beings. Although the overpopulation myth is distinct from the Diarmuid/Yima mythos, a thematic correspondence exists between Shiva as the origin of death and his Irish counterpart Finn as ultimately imposing death on Diarmuid in the conclusion of his myth. See Mahabharata 12.248.13-14 and 7, Appendix 1, number 8. See also Stella Kramrish, The Presence of Shiva, the chapter The Creation of Death and the Cycles of Time. Within the Indian tradition, it seems that either Shiva originates death or death exists alongside Prajapati, directed subsequently by Varuna and others, and then Yama allows it to enter the line of thenceforward mortal humans. Thus it appears to be the Iranic Yima with by far the closest story in the Indo-Iranic world to what we see in the Genesis fall myth. Yima has the forbidden female counterpart and also a forbidden food, and does ultimately fall from a golden age of deathlessness by breaking a divine rule, being chased down and killed by a serpentine pursuer, whose first name, Azi, literally means snake or dragon, and as Encyclopedia Iranica says, quote, it is not clear whether he was originally considered as a human in dragon shape or a dragon in man shape, unquote. From Encyclopedia Iranica, Azdaha. Indeed, the fact that of the options on the table, it is Yima whose antagonist is most directly named the serpent, argues strongly in favor of the source of the Adam and Eve motifs being Iranic. The Vedic Yama has no clear serpentine antagonist whatsoever, while the Irish Diarmuid's pursuers, the nephews of Goll and Finn, may have serpentine associations, but only via a deductive argument using a broad view of their mythos. Along with having an antagonist named the serpent, a forbidden food of extending life, and a fall from a deathless state, the Iranic mythos of Yima has another thing in its favor that could explain what we are looking at: the Zoroastrian reforms, as well as pre-Zoroastrian concerns over animal sacrifice. The myths and cults of the Iranic world were radically altered at some point in order to shift much of the region into the Zoroastrian religion. This affected religious practices, but also would have been reflected in myths and ethics. The fact that the forbidden food of Yima is meat, and that Yima's use of it is complained of as a sinful act of Yima in Yazidi 32, where the author is Zarathustra himself, suggests that the type of food involved in the forbidden food story could have been a serious focus of the ethical reforms of Zarathustra. Because Zarathustra viewed certain kinds of animal sacrifice as the ultimate demonic act, it is possible that he modified the details of the forbidden food story to make certain kinds of meat eating the original sin instead of fruit eating. This meat reform may also have been underway when Zarathustra only furthered it, as Moulton remarks, quote, "Note that in thus abolishing sacrifice, the prophet only went a step beyond Iranian custom as described by Herodotus, in which the gods only partook of the spiritual essence of meat that would be eaten by their worshippers." Unquote. Because the protection of the quote-unquote beneficent animal, the cow or ox, of the Yasnas was so central to Zarathustra's theology, the original sin of humanity is consistently framed as the betrayal of the animal through slaughter and meat eating. The original sin of humanity is consistently framed as the betrayal of an animal through slaughter and meat eating in surviving Zoroastrian texts. In the Buddhism, a later Zoroastrian text, which often preserves very old oral traditions, we read that the first human couple, Masha and Mashan, sinned first by killing a goat. This again recapitulates meat eating as the sin of the first people, suggesting a consistent theological focus on this food type as the source of sin. As the version from the Indian Buddhism reads, quote, "And in 40 years, with the shape of a one-stemmed rivas plant, and the 15 years of its 15 leaves, Masha and Mashan grew up from the earth in such a manner that their arms rested behind on their shoulders, and one joined to the other. They were connected together and both alike. And the waists of both of them were brought close and so connected together, that it was not clear which is the male and which the female, and which is the one whose living soul of Ormazd is not away. As it is said thus, which is created before, the soul or the body? And Ormazd said that the soul is created before, and the body after, for him who was created. It is given into the body that it may produce activity, and the body is created only for activity. Hence the conclusion is this, that the soul is created before and the body after, and both of them changed from the shape of a plant into the shape of man, and the breath went spiritually into them, which is the soul. And now, moreover, in that similitude, a tree had grown up whose fruit was the 10 varieties of man. Ormazd spoke to Masha and Mashan thus, You are man, you are the ancestry of the world, and you are created perfect in devotion by me. Perform devotedly the duty of the laws, think good thoughts, speak good words, do good deeds, and worship no demons. Both of them first thought this, that one of them should please the other, as he is a man for him. And the first deed done by them was this. When they went out, they washed themselves thoroughly, and the first words spoken by them were these, that Ormazd created the water and earth, plants and animals, the stars, moon, and sun, and all prosperity whose origin and effect are from the manifestation of righteousness. And afterwards antagonism rushed into their minds, and their minds were thoroughly corrupted, and they exclaimed that the evil spirit created the water and earth, plants and animals, and the other things as aforesaid. That false speech was spoken through the will of the demons, and the evil spirit possessed himself of this first enjoyment from them. Through that false speech they both became wicked, and their souls are in hell until the future existence. And they had gone 30 days without food, covered with clothing of herbage. And after the 30 days they went forth into the wilderness, came to a white-haired goat, and milked the milk from the udder with their mouths. When they had devoured the milk, Masha said to Mashiane thus, "My delight was owing to it when I had not devoured the milk, and my delight is more delightful now when it is devoured by my vile body." That second false speech enhanced the power of the demons, and the taste of the food was taken away by them, so that out of 100 parts, 1 part remained. Afterwards, in another 30 days and nights, they came to a sheep, fat and white-jawed, and they slaughtered it, and fire was extracted by them out of the wood of the lote plum and box tree, through the guidance of the heavenly angels, since both woods were most productive of fire for them, and the fire was stimulated by their mouths. And the first fuel kindled by them was dry grass, kendar, lotos, date palm leaves, and myrtle. And they made a roast of the sheep. And they dropped 3 handfuls of the meat into the fire and said, "This is the share of the fire." 1 piece of the rest they tossed to the sky and said, "This is the share of the angels." A bird, the vulture, advanced and carried some of it away before them, as a dog ate the first meat. And first a clothing of skins covered them. Afterwards, it is said, woven garments were prepared from a cloth woven in the wilderness. And they dug out a pit in the earth, and iron was obtained by them and beaten out with a stone. And without a forge, they beat out a cutting edge from it. And they cut wood with it, and prepared a wooden shelter from the sun. Owing to the gracelessness which they practiced, the demons became more oppressive, and they themselves carried on unnatural malice between themselves. They advanced one against the other, and smote and tore their hair and cheeks. Then the demons shouted out of the darkness thus, "You are man, worship the demon, so that your demon of malice may repose." Masha went forth and milked a cow's milk, and poured it out towards the northern quarter. Through that the demons became more powerful. And owing to them, they both became so dry-backed that in 50 winters they had no desire for intercourse. And though they had had intercourse, they would have had no children. And on the completion of 50 years, the source of desire arose, first in Masha and then in Mashiane. For Masha said to Mashiane thus, "When I see thy shame, my desire arises." Then Mashiane spoke thus, "Brother Masha, when I see thy great desire, I am also agitated." Afterwards, it became their mutual wish that the satisfaction of their desires should be accomplished, as they reflected thus, "Our duty, even for those 50 years, was this," unquote. From the Indian Buddhism, chapter 15. As we can see, much of this reads again like an Adam and Eve type story, and here once again we have meat as the sinful food, along with milk. Furthermore, we find Masha and Mashiane split from one originally connected being, very similar to Adam and Eve, and clothed in herbage, reminiscent again of the Genesis pair. Masha and Mashiane are directly addressed by the high god and told what he expects of them, worship and obedience, and they quickly break this command and do the opposite, falling then into sin, death, and even spiritual punishment. What the Masha and Mashiane story lacks, however, is 1. A forbidden food that actually gives some particular magical potency, like extended life or divine knowledge. 2. A scene of tempting of the wife by a third party. 3. And this third party being a serpent figure. All of that we can find more plausibly in the orbit of Yima, reinforced by his parallel Diarmuid. The Indian Buddhism says that, quote, antagonism, unquote, rushed into both of their minds to make them speak the false word, while the greater Buddhism directly names the adversary as the one pushing Masha and Mashiane to sin in this moment. Quote, the adversary attacked their thoughts and vitiated their minds. They exclaimed, "The evil spirit gave the water, the earth, the tree, and other things." As aforesaid, this is the first false utterance, which they are constrained to utter by the compulsion of the devs. The evil spirit appropriated from them this first satisfaction, that owing to that false utterance they both became wicked, and their souls will be in the wicked existence until the final material life. For 30 days they were in search of food and put on garments of grass. Thus this points to a survival of a role comparable to the serpent, here disembodied as the adversary, and attacking them within their minds, but both of them at the same time, rather than just the wife. Nonetheless, in many other details, the Masha and Mashiane story reinforces a consistent set of details shared with the Adam and Eve and Yima stories, while providing a couple of additional pieces that may have been borrowed alongside the Yima material. That is, looking at the available set of Iranic data, we can reconstruct a very comprehensive set of parallels for the Adam and Eve story as a whole, if we bring together the magical forbidden food and tempting by a serpent sequence from the Yima orbit and reflected in Yima's equivalent Diarmuid, with the splitting apart from one being and wearing herbage found in the Masha and Mashan story. In this, we should keep in mind that the Vedic Yama is also said to be clothed with leaves in his tree in the Rig Veda, as aforementioned. In short, we can postulate that the Genesis author was likely drawing from an early version of both the Yima and Masha and Mashan stories, compositing them together to make the ultimate first human fall scene, or drawing from a version of the story where these details all belonged to Yima himself. Perhaps at some point, some of those details were given to Masha and Mashan and were originally of the Yima type, or perhaps originally they were like doubles of one another with different roles. Because the meat-eating taboo is found in both of these first human/fall stories, but is not found in European versions, for instance, the fact of the Zoroastrian reforms, if not some reform preceding Zoroaster, and noted by Herodotus, allows us to suggest that there was an older version of the Yima and possibly of the Masha/Mashan story in which the forbidden food of extended life was fruit. And this reconstructible earlier Iranic version is then the most likely source of the Genesis story. This makes sense when the meat of Yima is looked at a bit more closely. The meat of the ox or cow in Yasna 32 is said to have been given by Yima in portions, baga, to give life to his people. The word baga indicates the portions of a sacrifice and so suggests a sacrifice here, similar to the hauma/soma sacrifices, which involved a combination of cows and plant-derived sacred liquid being sacrificed and consumed. This interpretation of the ox meat of Yima as actually intertwined with a hauma sacrifice is supported by the later portion of this same Yasna. Quote, "To his undoing, Grainne and the Kavis have long devoted their purpose and energies, for they set themselves to help the liar, and that it may be said, the ox shall be slain that it may kindle the averter of death, equals Hauma, to help us. Thereby hath come to ruin the Karapan and the Kavi community, through those whom they will not have to rule over their life." Unquote. The word here for averter of death is the traditionally recognized title of the Hauma itself, Duraosha. In the Yasna Haptang Haiti and the Younger Avesta, the word Duraosha becomes a standard formal title for the Hauma plant. The most explicit evidence for this is found in the Hom Yasht, a long prayer dedicated entirely to the Hauma plant. In this text, Hauma is personified and speaks to Zarathustra, identifying itself as the source of vitality and the averter of death, Duraosha. In the Vedic parallel, the equivalent word is Amrita, literally not, plus mrita, death. And in the Vedas, Amrita is the literal alternate name for the soma juice. Thus, in the Yasna in question, the wicked priests are saying that the ox must be slain to kindle the Hauma in the sacrifice, which will avert death, bring extended life, like the fruit of Diarmuid does. And this ox-slaying rite is based on the model provided by the act of Yima at the start of this Yasna. The soma itself in the Vedas, a plant drink, was repeatedly identified with a cow or bull as well. The god Soma is said to go like a bull to the straining sieve in the Soma hymns. The Soma sacrifice, due to the power of the plant drink, was connected to immortality. Rig Veda 8.48.3 famously reads, quote, "We have drunk the Soma, we have become immortal, we have gone to the light, we have found the gods. What can hostility do to us now? And what the malice of a mortal, O immortal one?" Unquote. Rig Veda 8.48.3. We then see this theme extended into parallel European stories where we find plants and even fruit that bear the power of immortality for humans and gods. The apples of Idun in Norse myth, the apples of the Hesperides in Greek, the berries of the forest of Dubros in Irish. Indeed, the effect of the berries of the quicken tree of the forest of Dubros bears a close resemblance to the power of the Soma itself. Therefore, we can argue that esoterically the berries of the tree of Dubros show a continuity with the Soma-type substances that we can compare to. The story even compares them to vivifying wine, saying, quote, For no disease or sickness seizes any one that eats 3 berries of them. And they who eat feel the exhilaration of wine and the satisfying of old mead. And were it at the age of a century, he that tasted them would return again to be 30 years old." Unquote. From The Pursuit of Diarmuid and Grainne. The berries may thus be another embodiment of the same consumable sacred essence that is the sacred drink, like sacred wine, found again, for instance, in the figure of Dionysus, who embodies that essence for the Greeks, and is both food and drink of life, embodying their sacred wine. Note also that Dionysus is simultaneously a bull, whose tearing apart and consumption is seen as something close to a sin, connected to the negatively portrayed Titans, with the slaying of Dionysus Zagreus passing on that sin-like Titan nature to humans, and also the sacred liquid, which gives the vivification. Credit to Neil Sendlak for being the first person, as far as I know, to posit that the sacrifice and consumption of Dionysus by the Titans is a parallel of the forbidden fruit, or food, mythos of Genesis. In sum, because the signs of the forbidden food being meat are comparatively slim and cryptic outside of Iran, as in the Dionysus example just mentioned, and instead there is a more consistent pattern of plants or even fruits of extended life, sometimes turning into wine or a drink, and because the sacrifice of Yima's meat also seems to be a reflection of a part of the Hauma/Soma type sacrifice, we can suggest that the shift to an exclusive focus on meat was a short step from the plant substance of the sacrifice, the Hauma for instance, to the meat substance of the same sacrifice, which already overlapped conceptually as giving extended life. This shift would have been theologically motivated, as Zarathustrian reforms and their predecessors took direct issue with the blood sacrifice portion of the rite, while the original Iranic forbidden fruit would have been an echo or direct symbol of the Hauma plant. The new forbidden food was the product of the bloody act that accompanied that plant. The plant was made morally neutral, while its neighbor, the meat, took on the sinful connotation in the Reformed story. Hence we can see that the Iranic, that is Persian, source offers us the most likely location for the borrowing that we see in the Adam and Eve story. Although the forbidden food is meat, this is a relative outlier in the Indo-European world. And so, by using the Diarmuid story as triangulating evidence, we can explain this outlier as the result of an Iranic reform based on the campaign against blood sacrifice, of certain types at least, a reform that changed the forbidden food that had originally been fruit. This reconstructible Iranic story form is then the most plausible source that explains what we find in the Genesis story, taking into account the triangulated evidence from Ireland. In what way are the nephews of Goll serpentine? The nephews of Goll have a plausible serpent equivalence, an implied alternate form, if we consider them as emanations of Goll. They are the nephews of Goll, but note that one of the 2 nephews of Goll has the name Aidh, meaning fire, which is the very name of Goll. Goll is born as Aidh, fire, and gains the name Goll when his eye is poked out. Then we have here his nephew Aidh, fire, seeming to carry on this side of his uncle, Goll. Tracing out the connections within Irish myth, the trail of equivalences begins with Goll equals Finn. The all-knowing fishman, Fintan, loses one eye at Asaro, and so gains the name the One-Eyed One of Asaro, or in Irish, Goll Essa Ruath, the salmon of knowledge. Thus we see that Fintan is one and the same with Goll, the One-Eyed, or they are 2 names of one divine being. That is the salmon of knowledge. Therefore, we should see the rival Fianna leaders, Goll MacMorna and Finn MacCool, as 2 sides of the same warband leader god, just as Goll and Fintan are 2 names of his fish form. Goll/Finn stands for a deity who appears to have numerous other epithets. Fachtana Fahach, the hostile wise one, arguably another aspect of Finn, the hostile god of wisdom, is equivocated with a pair of worms in the story of Conchobar's conception. That is, the text, the conception of Conchobar, tells 2 versions of Conchobar's conception. First saying that Fachtana went to lie with Nessa and fathered Conchobar by her, and then noting that other people say Nessa drank a drink from a river and swallowed 2 worms in her cup, conceiving Conchobar thereby. This is found in the version of the story called Compart Conchobar to the long version, in RIA MSD IV 2. See also Conchovar's Birth, Revisiting the Texts by Anna Paget. Quote, "Drink yourself then," said Kava, "what you would ask me to drink, or you will be dead if you do not drink the water." Then the woman drinks 2 sips from the water, and she drinks a worm in each sip. The woman was pregnant then for the length of time that each woman is pregnant, and some said afterward that it was by the worms that she became pregnant. However, Fachtana Fahak was the woman's lover, and it was he who caused the pregnancy behind the back of Kava, the noble druid. Then Conchovar took the kingship of Ulster, after that through the rank of his mother and his father, that is, Fachtana Fahak, son of Ruri, king of Ireland, his father, and it is he who begot Conchovar in Kava's place." Unquote. If the worms and Fachtana are 2 versions of the same divine being, then the deity underlying Fachtana, the hostile wise one, may have originally had a serpentine form in Gaelic mythology. Let's not forget that Zahak does have 2 serpents, one on each shoulder, and that the nephews of Goll are 2 brothers. It may be that the fish form took over for the similar serpent form in the case of Goll Fintan in most of their mythology. This fits with the fact that Finn's burning his finger on the cooking salmon of knowledge and sucking his burned finger, gaining thereby the knowledge intended for the one who had set him cooking it, is a known parallel of Sigurd cooking the heart of the dragon Fafnir, burning his finger on it and sucking it, gaining thereby the knowledge intended for the one who had set him cooking it. Therefore, in 2 closely connected northwestern European cultures, fish stands equivalent to dragon, aka worm, for this tail type, which is classified in the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index as ATU 673, or the white serpent's flesh. Oddly, this tale of Finn eating the salmon of knowledge finds its Indian parallel in the story of Ganesha eating the fruit of knowledge, given by his parents Shiva and Parvati, but without consequent punishment. See Surendra Gopal, Commerce and Crafts in Gujarat, 16th to 17th century, page 12. This story does, however, demonstrate that a divine fruit of knowledge is and was known in Indian lore, even if utilized in a different myth. For those who have been following my channel closely, you will note that I have argued that Goll himself is in a role very eerily similar to the figure Kronos, the god of time, in the Orphic cosmogony, because Kronos is the serpent who wraps around the cosmic egg tightly and causes it to burst open. I have paralleled this to when Kull impregnates Myrnia and Goll reflexively attacks him to take revenge on him, but Goll and Kull are 2 sides of one, and this is the moment of the breaking open of the cosmic egg, so to speak. We also have Rudra as Kala, the god of time, equivalent to Kronos once again, Kronos being a serpent in that story. Finally, if we understand the direct parallels of Goll/Finn in other Indo-European branches, we see that they consistently have serpent forms. Odin, the serpent form he takes under the name Bolverker when he enters the mountain of Suttungr to steal back the mead, as well as Ofnir and Svafnir, and also Rudra, who has the name Ahirbudnya, the serpent of the deep, and Asi-Dahaka himself of the Iranian material. Asi-Dahaka, or Zahak, direct parallel of the nephews of Goll in the story in question, supports the serpent parallel for them in the most straightforward manner of all. However, to avoid circularity, we can point out how the names connected to Goll also suggest a worm/serpent form for this god. Therefore, we can suggest that the nephews of Goll parallel the serpent, though the serpent form is euhemerized out of the extant story. The Yazidi parallel. The serpent role, the third-party tempter of the forbidden fruit episode, being an emanation of a Rudra-type deity, is further supported by the parallel found in the Yazidi version of the forbidden food motif. The Yazidis are a fascinating case of a people who may potentially preserve Iranic-type material with roots predating the Zoroastrian reforms, and with story forms and theological contents that avoided at least some of the impact of the reforms, or may have even been poised directly against them. It is no accident that the Yazidis became seen as demon worshippers by their neighbors, and this may be because they maintained worship of a pre-Zoroastrian deity or deities who were demonized into figures like Ahriman and Zahak by the Zoroastrians. If a people were to continue to worship that god, then people around them would call them devil worshippers, as seems to have happened with the Yazidis. The central emanation of the divine that is worshipped by the Yazidis is the peacock angel, who others call a demon, Tawusi Malik. Meanwhile, it is said that the only good creation of Ahriman in Zoroastrian material was the peacock, among other connections noted in the following. Though some of the mythical genealogy of the Yazidis is mysterious, Encyclopedia Iranica states, quote, pre-Islamic Zoroastrian tradition indicates some link between Ahriman and the peacock, and this ambiguity may predate Islam. It has been suggested on the evidence of pre-Zoroastrian Iranian cosmogony and its similarity to Yazidi cosmogonies that the Yazidis' ancestors venerated a benign demiurge who set the world in its current state in motion. The role of this figure may have become ambiguous when they came into contact with Zoroastrians, whose cosmogony was essentially similar, but whose demiurge was Ahriman. Thus, Yazidism would be not a form of Zoroastrianism, but a religion possessing an Iranian belief system akin to it." Unquote. Now, as Finn/Goll is of the Odin/Rudra Indo-European god type, we can also suggest that both Azidahaka and Ahriman have intensive continuity with this Rudra god type. As Ahriman creates the peacock as his signature creation, so Shiva and his son Murugan are characterized by the peacock as a signature bird of theirs. Murugan, the son, rides the peacock as his mount, and it is among the symbols associated with Shiva, as well as with Vishnu. Shiva's son rides the peacock, see Shiva Purana 2.5.21. But Shiva also becomes a peacock in one legend. Shiva is also Nilakantha, the one with the blue throat from drinking the world poison, while the peacock is traditionally called Bujangabhuk, one who devours serpents. It is believed to eat poisonous snakes and transmute that venom into the eyes of its feathers. This then thematically and aesthetically echoes Shiva's famous act of drinking the poison, thus helping purify the nectar of immortality, and having his own throat turn blue, reminiscent of a peacock's color. The form of Shiva known as Chanda Bhairava has a mount, the peacock. Chanda Bhairava is depicted holding or adorned with the bird's attributes to signify his mastery over the poison of the ego and his connection to his consort, Kaumari, the female aspect of Shiva's son, Kumara aka Murugan, who rides the peacock. Finally, in Tamil Shaivism, a local legend of the Mayuranatha Swami temple is told in which Shiva's wife Parvati was reborn as a peahen as a form of penance. After she performed extensive worship of Shiva, he transformed into a male peacock to match her. In this peacock form, he performed a special version of his cosmic dance known as the Gauri Thandavam, the peacock dance of Gauri. So there exist several points of relation to the peacock in Shiva's mythos, and if Ahriman merely creates the peacock, this could mirror the close connection of Shiva's son Murugan, or Kartikeya/Kumara, and the peacock, which is his mount. This furthermore would connect to our claim that the peacock angel of the Yazidis, Tawusi Malik, parallels the role of the sons or nephews of the Rudra Shiva type rather than the high god himself. This would fit with the claim that the forbidden food tempter/catalyst role is consistently filled by figures who are equivalent of the sons or lower emanations nearby to sons of the Rudra Shiva type. Rudra is, of course, the destroyer god. His guna is that of darkness, while Ahriman is the hostile spirit of destruction and dark things. In an ecstatic and duality transcending sense, Rudra is even called, quote, the cheat, the arch-deceiver, the lord of stealers, unquote, in the Yajurveda litany to his many names, Yajurveda 16.20, while Ahriman is the lord of the lie, or druj, but in a much more purely negative black and white sense. Rudra attacks Prajapati, the creator god, who is known for sexually consorting with his own daughter as a main part of the creation myth, while Ahriman attacks Ahura Mazda, who is so firmly associated with consorting with his own daughter that the sacred taboo marriage of father and daughter is founded on Ahura Mazda's marriage with his daughter in the creation mythos. Rudra's subsequent attack on Father Sky, Dev, aka Daush Pitar, causes the seed of the god to fall to earth into a pit of fire, where the ancestors of humans spring, the Angirases. while Ahriman's subsequent attack on Gaiomard causes the seed of this divine giant to fall to earth, part of it being taken by the fire, Nerio Song, and from this the ancestors of humans spring, the aforementioned Masha and Mashan. Rudra is the lord of the ecstatic war bands and their rites, which were made anathema by Zoroaster's reforms. Rudra Shiva has the epithet Ahir Budnya, the serpent of the deep, while also wearing the great serpent Vasuki around his neck, echoing the serpents on the shoulders of Azidahaka. One of the Zoroastrian demons is Savol/Sarva, matching Rudra's epithet Sharva, and one of Rudra's forms is Manu, wrath, matching the Zoroastrian demon Aeshma, meaning wrath. So we can see aspects, names equivalent to the names of Rudra that are demons in the Zoroastrian pantheon consistently. We can therefore posit a clear comparative picture in which the serpent is an emanation of the Rudra-type god, who has a serpent form himself, as Azidahaka is to Ahriman like an extension of his own serpent aspect, as Ahirbudnya is a Rudra Shiva, and as the nephews of Goll are extensions of the Goll/Finn deity. Remember that Finn places his poisoned spear on his own forehead to keep himself awake in order to fight Allen and defeat him. And I've shown that this parallels when Shiva drinks the world poison, as aforesaid. This serpent-aspected destroyer god is simultaneously the peacock-aspected god or peacock-connected god. Hence, if Tawusi Malik is a survival of the peacock deity, then he is arguably the equivalent of an emanation of the god that the Zoroastrians would have considered the great devil, Ahriman, or his emissary, Azidahaka, the serpent king who pursues and kills Yima. Understanding the role of the peacock angel, Tawusi Malik, in Yazidi religion makes the surviving Yazidi Adam and Eve story from their black book incredibly interesting to our investigation. Quote, "At this time, the Lord came down to the Holy Land, Al-Quds, and commanded Gabriel to bring earth from the four corners of the world. Earth, air, fire, and water. He created it and put in it the spirit of his own power and called it Adam. Then he commanded Gabriel to escort Adam into paradise and to tell him that he could eat from all the trees but not of wheat. Here Adam remained for 100 years. Thereupon Melech Taus, or Tawusi Malik, asked God how Adam could multiply and have descendants if he were forbidden to eat of the grain. God answered, I have put the whole matter into thy hands. Thereupon Melech Taus visited Adam and said, Have you eaten of the grain? He answered, No, God forbade me. Melech Taus replied and said, Eat of the grain, and all shall go better with thee. Then Adam ate of the grain, and immediately his belly was inflated. But Melech Taus drove him out of the garden, and leaving him ascended into heaven. Now Adam was troubled because his belly was inflated, for he had no outlet. God therefore sent a bird to him, which pecked at his anus and made an outlet, and Adam was relieved. Now Gabriel was away from Adam for 100 years, and Adam was sad and weeping. Then God commanded Gabriel to create Eve from under the left shoulder of Adam." Unquote. Note that this Eve is created from under the left shoulder of Adam, and the shoulders are where Masha and Mashan were connected in the other Iranic material that we looked at from the Bundahishn. But it is the rib that is the detail, the location in the Genesis story. So why is the location of the shoulder shared between these two Iranic type stories? Note first how different this story is in its framing and details from the Adam and Eve Genesis story, while in other ways being an obvious variant of it. Once again, we have to ask why. Why the differences if it is merely a copy of Genesis? This again has all the markings of an authentic native survival, but with a thin veneer of later influence in the names, presumably. Note in particular who is in the exact role of the tempter, the exact role shared by the serpent of Genesis and the nephews of Goll of Diarmuid's story. It is none other than their central embodiment of divinity, the peacock angel, Tawusi Malik. This is a strange coincidence. Why is their most worshipped divine emanation placed in the role of the serpent if they are merely borrowing from Genesis? This would be a powerful, self-inflicted theological wound if they compose such a story via borrowing. But of course, when we understand that the nephews of Goll are aspects of the high god Finn/Goll or Fintan/Goll, and how Azidahaka is an emanation of Ahriman, who is merely a demonized form of the Indo-Iranic Rudra-type deity, among other things, a complex high god central to the worship of many, the picture becomes reasonably clear. Tawusi Malik, in the role of the tempter in the forbidden food sequence, appears to be a perfectly natural variation of the established concept that the lower emanation of the Rudra-type high god was archaically the tempter, as the Indo-Iranic serpent god is also the peacock god. It is also interesting that the forbidden food in this case is not meat, but a plant food, again, supporting our theory that the meat was inserted into Zoroastrian versions subsequent to the anti-meat or anti-blood sacrifice reforms, and that the Yazidi version originates from a version unaffected by that reform. Also of interest is the fact that it is not fruit in this case, but wheat. This brings us back then to the forbidden barley of Varuna in the Vedic case, and suggests that the barley/wheat and fruit were either parallel, similar motifs, or were somehow interchangeable in variants of the story type within the Indo-Iranic sphere. It is also worth noting that the wheat of Adam in this version does not extend life or give knowledge akin to the gods, but it does grant progeny, as does Yama's sinful decision to father children with Yima, and as does forbidden foods in other folkloric versions of this tale type. However, the wheat is positioned exactly as the one thing that cannot be eaten, and is seemingly tended by the angel Gabriel, in similar fashion to how the Sharvan Lachlanach is the keeper of the tree of the quicken berries of Dubros, from whom Diarmuid at first gains a hunting license. Along with this, Eve is here taken from under Adam's shoulder, similar indeed to what we find in Genesis, but forcing us again to ask, why would a borrower slightly change such a detail to make an unnecessary contradiction with the rib of the Genesis version, if they were going to the trouble of borrowing from the well-known Bible version? And again, fascinatingly, Eve does not appear as the one to suggest taking the food in this version, and is instead created only after Adam has taken the food by himself. This, of course, is out of step with the Indo-European pattern we have suggested in general, but the fact that it adds another point of significant difference between the Yazidi version and the Genesis story further supports the idea that this is a native Yazidi story that has generated its own variations, many of them quite odd, and so having the hard-to-explain flavor of authenticity. In sum, the Yazidi parallel supports the idea that the forbidden plant food was the probable archaic Iranic emphasis of the myth, even if meat could have been a related element at any point, that some kind of plant was originally the food among all others that was forbidden in the archaic story form, and that a lower emanation of the higher Rudra type, the higher type being identified with God himself in the Yazidi version, was the third-party tempter equal to the serpent. Triangulated with the Diarmuid and Yima stories, a pre-Zoroastrian Iranic source for much of the Genesis Adam and Eve story becomes difficult to avoid as the probable conclusion, the only one that takes in all available evidence. When we pinpoint the Iranic tradition as the likely source, it can be seen more readily that it is this tradition that also has two special trees, named one after another in the Greater Bundahishn. In the Zand Akasi, or Greater Bundahishn, along with the narrative of Masha and Mashan, these two trees are found. The trees exist in the same ocean and are named as the two special trees of Ahura Mazda's creation. The first is the Tree of All Seeds. From Bundahishn chapter 6d, quote, "Plants grew over the whole earth just like hair upon the heads of men. 10,000 of them grew up from that one principal species, in order to withstand the 10,000 diseases which the evil spirit designed forthwith for the creatures. Out of these 10,000, 130,000 species within species of plants grew up. The tree of many seeds, having been produced from all those seeds of plants, grew up in the ocean Frakvart, wherefrom the seeds of all the species of plants are growing on that tree." Unquote. Then the second tree is the white haum tree, or hauma tree, or Gokarena, from which the hauma, the sacred liquid of renewal and illumination, is produced. 2 fish guard this tree, while a lizard attempts to despoil it. Quote, "Near to that tree, the Gokaren tree was produced, in order to keep away ill-shaped decrepitude, and the complete exaltation of the world arose therefrom." Unquote. And later in the same text, quote, "One says in the scripture, the white haum, which they call the Gokarena tree, which has grown in the ocean Frakvart in the deep lake, is requisite for the performance of the renovation of the universe, as they will prepare immortality from it. And the evil spirit in opposition to it has produced a lizard in that deep water, so that it may despoil the home," that is the hauma, And in order to restrain that lizard, Ormazd has there created 2 carfish, which are always encircling the home, so that the head of one of those fish is always towards the lizard. And these fish also have spiritual food. That is, they do not require food, and they will be contending up to the renovation of the universe. And there is a place where those fish are written of as the aras of the water. As one says, the greatest of the creatures of Ormazd are those fish, and the greatest of the creatures of the evil spirit is that lizard, in body and vigor. They cleave into 2 parts, whichever of both the creations are betwixt them, except that one fish, which is the Vasi Panchasattvaram. This too, one says, those fish are so sensitive that they comprehend a sensation as minute as a sharp needle in the deep water, whereby the water increases or decreases." Unquote. This makes clear the possibility that the biblical authors could have drawn the majority of the elements found in the Genesis account from the interconnected elements that existed in the Iranic tradition they encountered in their time. The 2 separate trees, connected to life, healing, also illumination, renovation, and then the lizard who is trying to despoil that tree, along with everything else that we have seen. Is there anything here that can help us answer the question of why Adam and Eve's forbidden fruit is the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, rather than the fruit of life? We can see that both Yima and Masha/Mashan speak false and evil words, and this is a major piece of both of their falls. In the Yima story, as Georges Dumézil has traced in his book The Destiny of a King, this theme gets elaborated in different variations, including one in which the false speech is extended into an act of hubris, or hubris is a component of the false speech. Yima falsely declares himself on the same level as Ahura Mazda, and also flies to heaven in a chariot carried by the devs. Yima's chariot flight, although it is celebrated in one regard, is implicitly, if not explicitly, hubristic, as the chariot is carried by the devs, the devils of Zoroastrianism. Encyclopedia Iranica comments that, quote, "The motive of Yima's hubris continues into the post-Sasanian literature, for instance, the Shahnameh and the Farsnameh," unquote. Though Yima's act in this regard is not one of eating a food, the theme of hubristically trying to make oneself like the high god is identical to what is said of the fall of Adam and Eve in connection with the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of this fruit makes one like God, a knower of knowledge only proper to him, and thus it is the thematic match of Yima's hubris in this particular respect. If the Genesis authors then drew from the 2 distinct fall motifs within the wider Yima mythos, that of the forbidden food and that of the attempt to hubristically make oneself like God, and composited them into one scene of fruit eating, the fruit becoming the fruit of the hubris to try to be like God or to speak falsely on sacred things, then they would have been able to compose the basic Adam and Eve story from these. In this view, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil scene is a boiled-down retelling of both of Yima's falls as one simplified event, drawing also from the false speech regarding who made the world found in the Masha and Mashan story, or its predecessor. We must again consider that earlier forms of Yima's story, which we are forced to postulate, could have had different combinations of these fall motifs. We should also note that Vedic Soma gives extended life or immortality of some kind, but also enlightening knowledge, as its parallels, like the Norse mead of poetry, also support. And so divine knowledge as the flip side of the sacred plant of immortality is established in the Indo-Iranic world. Interestingly, Aver Dawn also speaks hubristically just before being killed by the storm, suggesting that this hubristic speech element may go back to the archaic shared root of the story. As John Carey notes on Dawn's hubris in his Laur Gawala Aaron death scene, quote, "Filled with an exultant arrogance, Dawn cries, 'Now I will bring under the edge of spear and sword all that there is in Ireland.' Whereupon the wind drives his ship upon a sandbank so that he drowns." Unquote. Clearly, this theme of hubris is a key component of this myth type and this god type. Vasu Uparicara. Georges Dumézil has pointed to another Vedic parallel of Yima, that is a Vedic figure who either is a legendary incarnation of Yama, or who is from a mythos separate from Yama, which was combined into Yima's mythos only in Iran. Dumézil debates which of these was the case and leaves it open-ended. This is Vasu Uparicara, who also has a fall akin to that of Yima, a fall based on uttering a false word and also flying in the air in a chariot, as Yima flies in a chariot up to the heavens while also being famed for his hubris and subsequent fall. Uparicara has a flying chariot as well, which loses its ability to fly when he makes his false pronouncement. Having come to the ground as a result, he further sinks into the earth itself as a sort of punishment. Dumézil narrates, quote, "Formerly beset with doubt about the legitimacy of butchered food, the rishis, the sages, raised the question in consultation with Vasu, king of Yazidi. And Vasu, although he knew that meat could not be eaten, answered that it could be. At that very instant, he fell from heaven to earth. Then, having repeated this wrong answer, he sank beneath the ground. In the 12th book, the story is told with many more details, and the problem under debate concerns not only slaughtered food, but animal sacrifices in general. Moreover, at the end, Vasu is saved, restored, like Yayati through his grandsons, here by the intervention of Vishnu. Once upon a time, the gods and the rishis had a dispute about a point of divine law. The gods, directly interested in the matter, maintained that the object of sacrifice, Aja, should remain as it was traditionally, the goat, the word Aja, in fact, being the ordinary name for the goat itself. The rishis, contesting this position, and probably pushed into an aggiornamento by the progress of the times, quibbled over the word Aja, analyzing it as a compound Ja, not born. They maintained that it refers to the seeds of plants and that, as a result, the gods should content themselves with offerings of barley. The discussion quickly grew heated, as it often does among ritualists. Suddenly the two parties, the conservatives and the progressives, saw Vasu Uparicara coursing through the atmosphere at the controls of his crystal chariot. With common accord, they took him as their arbiter, and the rishis confronted him with the two doctrines. Knowing the wishes of the gods, the king decided in their favor. Sacrifices, he determined, should be celebrated with animal victims. Then the rishis punished him. "Since you have taken the side of the gods," they said, "you will fall from the sky. From this day you will lose the power which you have to circulate in the air. By our curse, you will sink far below the surface of the earth." Indeed, the unfortunate king dropped to the earth immediately and found himself at the bottom of a deep pit. But the gods did not abandon the one who had sinned to serve them. Almost the same account, this time with the final redemption, is summarized briefly in the 14th book. "Blessed man," the rishis said to him, "what is the Vedic teaching concerning sacrifices? Is it preferable to celebrate them with animals or with grains and juices?" Vasu's answer was a hasty one. He did not weigh the pros and cons or examine the arguments of the two briefs, but heedlessly declared, "Of the two materials, sacrifices may be celebrated with the one that lies close to hand, no matter which it may be." This response, which was a lie, caused him to be hurled into the subterranean regions of Rasatala. Unquote. From Dumézil, Destiny of a King, pages 63 to 64. The myth of Uparicara's fall from the clouds into the depths of the earth provides a structural twin to the loss of Yima's Kvarena, royal glory. What is most interesting in context of our investigation is that Uparicara's false pronouncement has thematic overlaps with the meat sacrifice issue that weighs heavily on both the Yima and Masha/Mashan fall accounts. Thus, whether this concern with the immorality of sacrifice truly goes back to before the split between the Iranics and the Indics, circa 1800 BCE, or each tradition simply developed concerns with nonviolent sacrifice in parallel or in dialogue in later times due to broader societal developments, Uparicara provides another example of a story possibly downstream of the broader archaic Yama/Yima forbidden food mythos. Uparicara utilizes a linguistic pun on the word Aja to side with the god's demand for blood sacrifice over and against the sage's preference for grain. This spoken judgment of Uparicara is treated as false, and he loses his divine favor, in spite of attempting to side with the gods themselves. So if Uparicara, flying in a chariot and then being cast down due to speaking falsely, can make him a Yima parallel, we may consider the Genesis fruit of knowledge of good and evil in this light. Uparicara most certainly attempts to pass judgment on what is morally correct, what is good, giving his kingly pronouncement that goat sacrifice is proper and ethical. This is false according to the higher divine law represented by the rishis, and so he has attempted to speak for this divine law, but incorrectly, at least to their minds. He has hubristically believed he could be the arbiter of sacred things toward his own desired ends, i.e., currying favor with the gods. When we place this ethical conundrum beside the similar case of Yima and that of Masha/Mashan, it seems increasingly plausible that the false speech about the nature of what is good and sacred in the world, which inherently involves hubris, may have been a consistent layer of the Indo-Iranic Yima/Yama mythos and its related offshoots from a very ancient time. This possibility should then be considered when thinking about what things were combined or boiled down to form the Genesis concept of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is also plausible that Uparicara could represent a mythos that was originally distinct from the Yama/Yami mythos, a mythos more centered on the ethics of sacrifice, and that this theme was absorbed by Yima only in the Iranic tradition as that theme became blended with Yima's fall narrative. The exact relationship of these mythemes in the archaic version has to be left open, as Dumasil did, but in either case, they were accessible to the Genesis adapter for his purposes. The Bran parallel. The pattern of the Rudra-type god's son or nephew or emanation being the one to catalyze the breaking of the taboo, the serpent rule, specifically in the nephews of Goll and Yazidi, leading to the entry of death or the exit from the paradisal realm, appears to be supported by the Welsh parallel, although this version is quite different in outward details. In the story of the Irish Dawn, he is the first to die as the sons of Meal arrive to Ireland, and asks his men to carry him to an isle off the southwest point of Ireland, where the dead stop on their way to the other world thereafter. After his death, Diarmuid's corpse is made to speak whenever Angus breathes into it, while we also find a figure in Irish legend named Dawn Bow, who is beheaded and becomes a singing severed head. See also the aforementioned Fohav Canaine, who becomes a singing severed head in a similar story type. So with this motif of the dead body or head of these two dawn-related figures speaking or singing after death, it is not a surprise that the figure who becomes a speaking severed head upon his death in Welsh mythology also specifically asks his men to carry his head to an isle off the southwest tip of Wales, Gwales. This should be enough to establish that the Welsh Bran is the equivalent of the Gaelic Dawn/Diarmuid, and is thus the Welsh Yama/Yima. This can further be supported by a comparison of Bran's time of feasting with his men at this southwestern isle and the description of the feasting that goes on with Yama in his afterlife realm as described in the Rig Veda. Quote, "Outrun the two dogs of Sarama's breed, four-eyed and brindled, along the path that leads straight to the goal. Then approach the forefathers, who are good to find, who reach exhilaration in joint revelry with Yama. Your two dogs, Yama, who are guardians, four-eyed guards of the path, with their eyes on men. To them deliver him, O king, provide for him well-being and freedom from disease." Unquote. From Rigveda 10.14.10-11. As Encyclopedia Iranica further points out, quote, "In the Mahabharata, Book 2, Section 8, Yama's assembly house is described in terms similar to the Vara. The Mahabharata description reads, quote, "Possessed of the splendor of the sun, it yieldeth everything that one may desire, neither very cool nor very hot. It delighteth the heart. In that assembly house there is neither grief nor weakness of age, nor hunger nor thirst. Nothing disagreeable findeth a place there, nor any kind of evil feelings there. Every object of desire, celestial or human, is to be found in that mansion. And all kinds of enjoyable articles, as also of sweet, juicy, agreeable, and delicious edibles in profusion that are licked, sucked, and drunk are there, O chastiser of all enemies. The floral wreaths in that mansion are of the most delicious fragrance, and the trees that stand around it yield fruits that are desired of them." Unquote. From Mahabharata 2.8. In the Mabinogi tale, Branwen, daughter of Llyr, we read the description of the feasting time at Bran's Isle that is very similar to these descriptions of Yama's domains. Quote, "And they went into the hall, and two of its doors were open, but the third door was closed, that which looked toward Cornwall. See yonder, said Manawyddan, is that door, that we may not open. And that night they regaled themselves and were joyful. And of all they had seen of food laid before them, and of all they had heard of, they remembered nothing, neither of that nor of any sorrow whatsoever, and there they remained 80 years, unconscious of having ever spent a time more joyous and mirthful. And they were not more weary than when first they came, neither did they, any of them, know the time they had been there." Unquote. Now we find ourselves in a paradisal, albeit eerie, feasting hall akin to that of Yama, where all sorrows are banished like the Garden of Eden, or even like the reign of Yima on earth. Note that while cares and memories of the world are banished in Bran's hall, we find that well-being and freedom from disease are similarly a feature of Yama's place of revelry in the cited hymn. But in Bran's hall there is immediately a prohibition as well, one thing that is not to be done while they are feasting, lest the sorrows of the world rush back upon the revelers. 2 doors are open and remain without prohibition, but there is a third that is prohibited. In this highly specific context, it is very coincidental that the one figure who breaks this prohibition, opening the prohibited door and causing the sorrows of the world, including presumably death, is none other than the son of Gwyn. Gwyn ap Nudd is the clear Welsh linguistic and mythic equivalent of Finn ua Nuadha, and thus a son of Gwyn is the equivalent of a son of Finn. However, the nephews of Goll, we have seen, are like emanations on a similar level as a son of Goll, and Goll and Finn are 2 sides of one. The fact that a son of Gwyn opens the prohibited door is then well explained by what our previous demonstration has pointed out. Goll and Finn, like Goll and Fintan, are really 2 sides of one and the same deity, 2 alternate names of a single archaic god. Thus, a son of Gwyn in the Welsh version can accurately parallel a nephew of Goll in the Irish version, with slight divergence in convention as the simple explanation of the change from a nephew of Goll to a son of Gwyn. It should be noted that Gwyn of the Welsh tradition lacks a Goll-like counterpart, a fierce rival warband leader to be his other side, and so we can argue that Gwyn embodies the Goll and Finn types simply presented as one, just as Fintan is also known as Goll Esaruath. So we read in the conclusion of the feasting of Bran's hall, quote, "One day said Haelin, the son of Gwyn, 'Evil betide me, if I do not open the door to know if that is true which is said concerning it.' So he opened the door and looked toward Cornwall and Aber Henvelen. And when they had looked, they were as conscious of all the evils they had ever sustained, and of all the friends and companions they had lost, and of all the misery that had befallen them, as if all had happened in that very spot, and especially of the fate of their lord. And because of their perturbation, they could not rest, but journeyed forth with the head toward London." Unquote. So the son of the Rudra type god Gwyn, that is Haelin, opens the sole prohibited door, and this instantly causes the sorrows of the world to rush back on the blissful feasters. Their paradisal time out of time comes to an end as a result, and they are even impelled out of the hall by their recollected need to bury the head of Bran, as Diarmuid and Grainne are driven out of the forest of Dubros after he takes the berries, and Adam and Eve are compelled to leave Eden after they take the fruit. The coincidence that the figure who catalyzes the breaking of the prohibition that leads to the end of the paradisal feasting is a son of the Rudra type, while the Dawn/Yama type, speaking severed head, is there with him, and they are feasting to their heart's content, allows us to strongly support that the serpent catalyst role was archaically a lower Rudra type emanation, effectively a son or nephew. In Canaanite terminology, this would be equal to a son of El, seeing that El is the equivalent of the Enlil/Rudra destroyer high god type, El even being a great archer, like Rudra, and paralleling him in other ways that I've discussed in another video. Furthermore, this Welsh case serves to support our broader picture. The core of this mythic sequence was deeply embedded in Celtic tradition, and could not have arrived via a one-off borrowing from the Bible into the story of Diarmuid and Grainne. Its appearing in outwardly different yet fundamentally aligned form in the story of the Welsh Yima/Dawn equivalent, Bran, with esoteric roles like the Rudra sun catalyst and other notable details in alignment, puts the theory of borrowing beyond plausibility. One interesting detail is that the reason that Haelin gives for needing to open the forbidden door is that he wants, quote, "to know if that is true," unquote, which is said about it. To know if it is true. We will have to wonder for a while more whether this is an intriguing coincidence or a remnant of a desire to know a truth which was a part of the archaic form of the myth and thus goes back to the shared root with the Iranic version. A plausible Greek parallel then offers itself when we understand Don Bo and Bran and Fohav Kanainya speaking or singing severed head figures as the Yima type, and that is Orpheus. Don has a few associations with music and poetry in his folklore. From Bealoidius 18, Contributions to a Study in Irish Folklore, Traditions About Don by Kate Muller-Lisowski, quote, Patrick Kennedy, in Fireside Stories, page 131, refers to Don na Djivkja as patron of poets, identifying him at the same time with Don of Tech Duin and Don of Knockfierna. Macanery. This poor harper became twice endowed with the gift of magic music by Don, but lost it each time on account of his greed. Tradition of music heard about the hill of Don was general. Music and a smiling dawn foreshadowed happiness. The girls who laid gifts on top of the hill often heard music and were glad. Old C, coming across the hill, heard the fairy music more than once. Cf. Tech Duin Cycle 17, Finn's Little Musician and His Fairy Wife. The poet Andrew McCurtain implores Don for his patronage. Unquote. As John Carey notes on Don's connection to poetry, quote, as the cauldron of poesy, the author claims the identity of white-kneed, blue-shanked, gray-bearded Averkin, and says that the nature of poetry should be made known in order to compose poetry for Aver Dawn, with many great chantings. Unquote. Very briefly, Orpheus is a singing severed head musician, like Don Bo is and like Fohav Kanainya is, and his story turns on his wedding to a woman, Eurydice. At the wedding, none other than a snake introduces the couple to death by biting and killing Eurydice. Orpheus goes to Hades to attempt to bring her back, notable since Yima also goes to hell, while Diarmuid attempts to retrieve his sick unto death sovereignty hag wife from the land under wave, a clear otherworld realm. Ultimately, Diarmuid completes the quest to heal her, but he realizes and she informs him that he does not love her, and so he parts and leaves her there, a conclusion resonant with Orpheus nearly retrieving Eurydice from Hades, but failing to do so at the last moment. As such, Orpheus's mythos has enough in common with the Yima-type mythos that we may consider the snake who bites Eurydice to once again potentially preserve the serpent role as the catalyst who introduces death to the happy newlyweds, further supporting this serpent role as a deep Indo-European inheritance. As Encyclopedia Iranica explains regarding Yima's trips to hell, quote, there are 3 references in the narratives above to Yima going to hell: for his sins, in order to close the door to hell so that death would be kept out, and in order to bring the paimanag, the right measure or sexual pleasure, out of hell. The Persian rivayats, differently from almost all other texts, also describe how Jamshid made humans immortal. Before he proclaimed himself universal monarch on New Year's Day, at the Creator's command, he went to the Chinvad bridge, closed the door to hell, and locked it so that Ahriman and the Divs could not enter, and so no one died during his reign. Unquote. 2 things jump out worth noting in this. One of Yima's trips to hell is to retrieve a divine item, somewhat inconsistently defined, that seems to embody either right measure or sexual pleasure, probably as an extension of the concept of right measure in the right context. The paimanag. The paiman or paimanag as right measure is what characterizes Yima's reign while he possesses the sovereign Kvarena, and so it seems understandable that the retrieval of the lost paiman from hell could parallel the attempted retrieval of the sovereignty hag from land under wave by Diarmuid and the attempted retrieval of Eurydice by Orpheus. In each case, the hero tries to bring back an embodiment of some goodness lost from the paradisal golden time. Secondly, one of Yima's prominent trips to hell is to close the door to it. Specifically, the closing of the door to hell is what makes the people of Yima's kingdom immortal, or at least ensures that this immortality is not interrupted. This is uncannily similar to what we find in the Welsh story of Bran, where Bran's feasting hall features one closed door, and as long as that door remains closed, the sorrows of the world, which logically include death, are locked out and cannot assail those within the hall. As such, we must consider that the closed door of the Hall of Bran might again be an archaically surviving detail, a motif that existed in parallel and in connection with the forbidden food and has simply become the central mechanism of the gain and loss of immortality within the Welsh version. It seems that the archaic Indo-European story had numerous interconnected steps or variations in the long sequence of the fall, and these were generally simplified in each tradition over time to yield the versions that survive in each tradition. There may have originally been the forbidden food, the sacrifice related to the food, the false speech that is hubristic, that loses the sovereign favor, the protective enclosure, and the door that keeps out death and other worldly sorrows. These may have been connected in a careful sequence or have existed in a set of variants from archaic times. Nonetheless, the existence in the Welsh myth of the door in the hall of the Yima equivalent that keeps out the sorrows of the world should not be undervalued as a possible ancient survival from this archaic mythos. The question of losing and retrieving the right measure of the ideal sovereign in this story of Yima could also offer another point of comparison for how the knowledge of good and evil became the turning point for the fall in the Genesis version. Right measure is the proper balance of justice and decision-making, belonging to the king as representative of God. Perhaps Yima's retrieving of this foreshadows his failure to uphold it. The story of Diarmuid concludes with a common folkloric motif when Finn almost gives Diarmuid renewed life, but then, at the last minute, does not. This near miss of healing, where the healing carries the implication of continually renewed life and thus immortality, is a theme found in world folklore traditions regarding the origin of death. A version of this motif appears in the famous episode of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a serpent steals the plant of immortality away as Gilgamesh sleeps, just before he can make use of it. With Finn also seen as the esoteric serpent god, continuous with Goll and his nephews, this makes a beautiful parallel between the serpent taking away the plant of immortality from Gilgamesh in a near-miss moment, and Finn withholding the water of healing at the very last moment, almost healing Diarmuid and then allowing him to be taken by death. Folkloric motifs common to the origin of death stories can be identified in both the Diarmuid and the Bran tales. Diarmuid's saga, leading from one tragic cause to the next until his death, begins with his boyhood. As a boy, he and the son of the head steward to Angus are playing. The two boys are half-brothers, having the same mother, and are reared together under Angus's guardianship. One night they are all together and Finn and Dawn are present as well. And, quote, a great fight arose between two of Finn's hounds about some broken meat that was thrown to them, unquote. The son of the steward runs between the legs of Diarmuid's father, Dawn, and Dawn kills the boy by squeezing his knees together. Finn has to scry to see that Dawn was the murderer, and then the steward turns his dead son into a wild boar. The steward puts the boar son under bonds to bring Diarmuid to death, and to live no longer than Diarmuid. In the context of the near miss at immortality and other origin of death motifs, like the forbidden fruit itself, the beginning of the cause and effect in the saga also may have a death origin folklore motif for its basis. In some cases, we find that the origin of death is triggered when something belonging to death is taken or killed. Then the people or divine beings owe death a debt, which of course is paid by the entry of death into their society. This is a feature, for instance, of the tale of the Dan people of Africa, collected by Swiss anthropologist Zemp in 1963, and cited in the article Two Themes on the Origin of Death in Sub-Saharan Africa by Denise Palm. Quote, nobody had seen Death until then, but the hunter met him. Death told him, well, you have seen my game. You have seen me. You are a hunter, I am a hunter. We are fellow hunters. The man stayed with Death for several days. Death gave him some meat. He thanked Death and brought some meat back to his village, but he did not know he was in debt. One day Death came to the village to ask for payment. He said, repay your debt. The hunter said, why, was not the meat a gift? Was it a loan? Death answered, I was in the bush. You came, you collected all my meat. Today you must repay me. The hunter said, all right, take one of my children. And Death thereupon caught his child, saying, I have come to you. Unquote. Zamp recorded another tale in a nearby region among the Bete people, with a similar debt concept. In this tale, a mother attempts to give her daughter to Death as a wife, but he does not respond. So she takes his meat, thinking a fair trade has been made. This again triggers Death, who has made no such agreement, to come to their village to seek his repayment. Quote, Death said, that woman, she is always taking away my meat. I will go after her. It was market day. People were dancing and there was quite a crowd. Death took away his wife in front of everybody. Nobody had died till then, and lo, the girl lay still. People began to weep. Death said, "Ah, I find plenty here, and I was staying in the bush. I have killed but one girl, and yet they weep." The week after, men agreed to have the funeral. They killed oxen. Death said, "That is good. I find plenty here. I will go on killing men." So women brought death. If that woman had not acted thus, men would not now die. Unquote. Under this reading of the Diarmuid story, the steward may be the embodiment of death itself, closely linked to Don Diarmuid, the Lord of the Dead, but distinct like Thanatos death is in relation to Hades or Orpheus. In this reading, as Diarmuid is an emanation of his father Don, the Lord of the Dead, so the son of the steward is like the avenging spirit of his father, who is death itself or stands in for it. The boar son becomes the symbol of the active force of death in the world. This may make sense of why the boar son is the half-brother of Diarmuid and gets tied to him so that their length of days are bound together until they slay one another in a strange moment of unification. Something has been killed and taken from the steward, and if he is death, then this is why death is now owed to him. Diarmuid's death is indeed owed to him, as it happens, and when that debt is finally collected, the entry of death into the world is signaled by Grainne, miscarrying triplets dramatically over the side of a rampart. Understanding the steward and his son as possible embodiments of death allows us to see the entire story of Diarmuid as playing out recognizable origin of death motifs that are traceable to archaic folkloric parallels, all culminating in the near miss at immortality when the serpent-related god Finn fails to give the healing water at the last moment. Note that broken meat thrown at hounds is also the first catalyst in the very beginning of the Diarmuid saga here, the thing that triggers the moment of murderous jealousy from Dawn. The breaking of animal meat creates a chaotic, blood-associated environment in which murder then takes place. Could this be a remnant of an ancient concept of death, arising first as a result of the killing of animals, or is this a coincidence? It may at least be one of the ingredients in the complex sequence. Furthermore, the forbidden fruit motif itself is found in world folklore, for instance in a couple well-documented African instances. As Abrahamson explains, quote, "A number of African myths concerning the origin of death are based upon the motif of the forbidden fruit, which is well known from the account of the fall in Genesis. In the foregoing, one such myth has been referred to from the Pangwe, though on account of its content, it was necessary to relate it in the first place to the subject begetting and death. According to this myth, Esamnyamabege, God, had 4 sons: Mode, man, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the serpent. One day, God went away with his sons, but left Mode and a woman behind, first impressing upon him certain instructions, warning him, amongst other things, that he must not eat the fruit ebon. This also implied that he might not have sexual intercourse. Later, God sent the gorilla, the chimpanzee, with foodstuffs to Mode, but they did not carry out the commission, so the serpent was sent instead. The latter induced Mode to eat of the fruit. When God came to know about this and came to Mode's village, Mode and the woman concealed themselves behind a banana tree. In reply to God's question as to why they did this, the man answered that he was afraid. Whereupon God said to the woman, "Und dir sage ich, du wirst Menschen gebären, aber die eine Hälfte wird sterben und die andere wird leben." If G. Tesman's version and interpretation are correct, then the motifs begetting and death and the forbidden fruit have merged and been developed as a myth, in which connection, however, the last mentioned motif has become the dominant element. Unquote. From Abrahamson, page 94. And, quote, "Among the Ephe, P. Shebesta was told that God created the first human being, Batsi, Baatsi, with the help of the moon. He kneaded the body into shape, covered it with a skin, and poured in blood. When the man had thus been given life, God whispered in his ear that he, Batsi, should beget children, and upon them he should impress the following prohibition: Of all the trees of the forest you may eat, but of the tahu tree you shall not. Batsi had many children, impressed upon them the prohibition, and then retired to heaven. At first, men respected the commandment they had been given and lived happily. But one day a pregnant woman was seized with an irresistible desire to eat of the forbidden fruit. She tried to persuade her husband to give her some of it. At first he refused, but after a time he gave way. He stole into the wood, picked a tahu fruit, peeled it, and hid the peel among the leaves. But the moon had seen his action and reported it to God. P. Shabesta adds, I could not believe my ears. That was the creation story of the Bible. Yet old Sabu, the informant, claimed, I heard this from my father. At that time, any influence of the Bible on the pygmies was completely unthinkable. Even today, they know nothing, not even a hint, of Christianity or missions. Even if this is the case, it does not, of course, exclude the possibility that the myth, which is also referred to by H. Trilles, may constitute an Eastern, in the last analysis, Oriental element in the Ituri culture, unquote, from Abrahamson, page 95. If one is following along closely, they will notice two remarkable details that are nearly smoking guns for the whole investigation. The wife is pregnant, and this leads to her having an irresistible desire for the fruit, and she tells her husband to take the fruit for her, and he goes and steals it and gives it to her. Neither of these details are in the Genesis account. Eve is not pregnant. She is not said to be seized with a desire, but she only says that the fruit appears to be desirable and good. And although she is the first one of the pair to urge the eating of the fruit to her husband, it is actually she who takes the fruit and gives it to Adam, and not the reverse, as in the folk tale and the Diarmuid and Grainne tale. So, oddly, this African tale and the Diarmuid and Grainne tale have more in common on these points than either has with the Genesis version. This makes it appear like these specific details may come from a deeper well of ancient folklore variations on this story type. It is also very intriguing that the author comments on the possibility that the story was from an Eastern/Oriental element in the culture. Furthermore, there is no serpent or third-party tempter here. If this were borrowed from Genesis, why remove this key character and the theological pivot he represents? It could happen, but it is another detail along with the others that makes simple borrowing very questionable. The only thing preventing this tale from being as close a match to the Eden story as the Diarmuid and Grainne story is the lack of the third-party tempter/serpent, but as it stands, it provides yet another incredible mirror with which we can triangulate and compare details and note a consistent pattern of specific details that are not accounted for by theories that fall back on simple borrowing from Genesis. Abrahamson's conclusion that this story may have come from Oriental influence rather than Christian is fascinating, and although we will likely never know its precise provenance in the Congo, an ancient Persian loan has to be left open as a possibility, as it would explain the strange affinity between the Irish and Efe stories. When a story sequence this precise only appears in one or two instances in a region and has striking foreign parallels, some kind of borrowing or shared root has to be considered. The Achaemenid Persian expansion, 525 BCE, first brought direct military and administrative contact to the Nilotic and Cushitic peoples of the Upper Nile, the northern and eastern neighbors of the Efe people in question, while the later medieval Shirazi era, in the 10th to 15th centuries, saw Persian settlers from Shiraz establish East African sultanates that permanently transformed coastal language and governance. These specific historical periods were reinforced by a continuous, centuries-long maritime trade route that circulated Persian textiles and glassware for African gold and ivory, leaving behind enduring loanwords like Serkali, government, Bandari, harbor, Chai, tea, Bakshishi, tip, and Dira, compass, in Cushitic and coastal Nilotic societies. Thus, though some African and other world folktales have the forbidden fruit motif, and even sometimes include a female as the catalyst of the sin or of death's origin in other ways, none of them come as close to the precise combination and sequence of elements found in the Genesis forbidden fruit passage as Diarmuid and Grainne's version does. This must be recognized clearly. The idea that ancient death origin motifs form the basis of the Diarmuid/Dawn type mythos in Celtic lore is supported by what we find in the story of the Welsh equivalent Bran. In some tales about the origin of death, for instance the tale of Lebe from the Bete people of Africa, someone has to try to guess the name of the figure who is Death. Death may enter the world as a response to this in various ways, because they guess correctly, because they guess wrongly, because someone tells the secret name, etc. The naming of death motif is recorded in a tale of the Bete people in which telling him his name triggers his action. But it is the one who tells the secret of death's name to someone else that receives the punishment, rather than the one who tells death's name to death. Quote, Lebe, death, said, "Before I give you food, you must say my name." "He is my brother," said Tata. "His name is Lebe." The spider remembers the name and tells the name to Lebe. Lebe gives him some food, but curses the one who told him the name to have his bowels sealed shut. Palm comments that, "So we understand the meaning of the other tale. Once death is named, once men know him, he must act." Unquote. It is interesting that the issue of bowels being sealed shut is found in both this story and the Yazidi myth of Adam. The theme of the guessing of death's name implies the possible variant that if someone guesses the name of death correctly, death may also be overcome, magically mastered, as we see in other folklore tales like Rumpelstiltskin, etc. So it is interesting to find that one of Bran's surviving myths involves Gwydion having to guess Bran's name in order to overcome and repel the attack of Arawn and Bran. Arawn is the putative lord of the underworld of Annuin, while Bran is the parallel of Dawn and ally of Arawn. And so it is plausible that Bran himself can serve as the embodiment of death in this story at least, just as Yama is frequently treated as embodying death itself, and these figures run together. Further interesting in this context is the fact that the battle between Arawn plus Bran and Gwydion plus Taliesin is triggered by a theft from Arawn's otherworld domain, Emetheon stealing 3 animals therefrom. This could be another survival of the motif of the taking from the Lord of Death, which triggers a debt and causes the Lords of Death to try to encroach upon the living. Only in this case, Gwydion successfully names Bran and so defeats the encroaching Lords of Death, effectively signaling the beating back of death by these wisdom gods, Gwydion and Gwion/Taliesin. The door that should not be opened, which we found in the story of the feasting of Bran's head, as well as in the story of Yima closing the door of hell to protect immortality, can also be grouped with these ancient folkloric death origin motifs. The understanding of all of these folkloric motifs helps solidify the story type we are dealing with, while also supporting the idea that these stories are not borrowings from Genesis, but instead come from a much deeper and more organic derivation from ancient lore, with its organic group of interrelated tropes. Otherwise, we would be unlikely to see the typical ancient variations on the theme that appear in the Celtic versions. What this understanding does not do, however, is allow us to write the whole Diarmuid story off as a random cluster of folkloric motifs. The identification of these motifs at work in the Celtic tales puts in relief the particular pattern of motifs shared between the Diarmuid and Yima stories, and thus helps to define the specific pattern of myth shared between them, from which they both were drawn. This then helps to refine the picture of the Iranic source with possible Indic echoes from which the Genesis version was primarily adapted. There is an orally preserved version of the origin of Buddhist Yama that is of interest to this investigation. Alexander Berzin, Introduction to the Vajrabhairava System of Anuttara Yoga, Tantra, Alexander Berzin, 2013, transcript, relates how the man who will become Yama is originally a sage, and we are told that he was in the midst of a 50-year meditation in order to get immortality. He is about to finish the 50 years when 2 thieves break into his cave with a stolen buffalo and kill it in front of him. He asks them to let him finish his 50-year meditation, but they behead him. His ascetic power turns to rage, and he puts on the buffalo head and kills the thieves, thus becoming Yama, who is treated as the embodiment and lord of death within Buddhist tradition. Yama besets the world with his raging power of death until he is eventually defeated by Manjushri/Yamantaka, when Yamantaka/Manjushri mirrors his own form back to him, but in even more terrifying size and complexity. A few things are interesting about this. The idea that this god type has his head severed, as it is in European parallels, Bran, Don Bo, Fohath Kanainya, Orpheus, Mimir, is preserved in this Buddhist version despite being absent or unclear in the Indian Yama and Iranic Yima traditions, where Yima is only vaguely cut apart. The sage in the story almost gains immortality, but loses it at the very last second and is killed, turning him into the god Yama. This is the classic theme of origin of death tales found in the Gilgamesh tale, where the snake takes the plant at the last second, the Diarmuid tale, where Finn almost revives him but does not at the last second, and others in world folklore, such as the myth of Adapa, who almost gains immortality but is tricked out of it and loses it at the last second. Part of the sin that occurs to cause the entry of death in this Buddhist tale is a theft of the buffalo and killing of an animal along with this theft. Theft and killing or sacrificing animals are often part of the origin of death tale types. We have seen theft with the Bran tale and killing of animals with Yima, with Masha and Mashan, and with Vasu Uparicara. And a case could be made that the twice-killed son of the steward in Diarmuid's tale ends up as another dead animal, simultaneously stolen from his father, Death. The forbidden fruit itself can also qualify as a sort of theft, of course, and while it is not an origin of death story per se, Dionysus as the killed bull Zagreus also includes the theme of killed animal along with the origin of a type of sin in the titanic nature inherited from this act. The theft and killing of the buffalo leads directly to the killing of the sage, and as usual, this creates a broken ordinance and a debt to the principle of death, leading to Yama, who embodies death here, being unleashed upon the world in reaction to this debt. Manjushri/Yamantaka, defeating Yama by taking on Yama's form, but in more terrible version, is comparable to Gwydion guessing the name of Bran to defeat him and Arawn. In both cases, the god of wisdom has to demonstrate mastery of either name or form of the death god, and this demonstrated mastery magically binds or overcomes him in one way or another. His very form or name acts like a net that catches and contains the power of death. The most consistent sin across these Indo-European derived stories seems to be theft or killing of animals, especially if the boar son of the steward is included, and speaking of a hubristic or false and hubristic word. These themes combine in the Indian story of Vasu Uparicara, for instance, where he speaks a false judgment and gives his sanction to animal sacrifice. As such, an overlap of these concepts can be posited in the pre-Reform Iranic version of the story, and in adapting from these motifs, the authors of Genesis may have essentialized these topics into the hubristic knowledge of good and evil that makes one like God. This much can be posited solely from the Indo-European material, and from there any other folkloric and philosophical motifs important to the author could have been blended into the iconically simple and mysterious fruit we find in the Bible. What of the beheading of Mimir, and can this shed more light on the stories we have been looking at thus far? Should the beheading of Mimir not have a trace of the same mythos we have been tracking? One interpretation seems possible, but it should not be misunderstood to mean that the tales have the exact same meanings. We are most interested to find vestiges, survivals of shared themes that have been cast into very different new forms and meanings, but which can be traced back to a shared root as suggested by the deaths of the parallel figures. Let us begin with a speculative parallel as a thought experiment before moving to the possible smoking gun that will clarify how the alignment works. Perhaps the pronouncement of Mimir's co-hostage Heinir, quote, "Let others give counsel," unquote, which leads to Mimir's beheading, is somehow the opening of choice, which is equivalent to the moment after the theft from the tree in Eden, if not to the dangling of the offer of the fruit by the tempter. Let others give counsel might be close to eat and be like God, knowing good and evil, in their deeper meanings, or let others give counsel may indicate the state of ambiguity resulting from the eating, the state just after. In this reading, it is not the ignorance of Heinir that causes the problem, but the possibility of choice which reveals itself when Heinir, the Shiva type, and Mimir, the Yama type, develop conceptual space between them, and they both develop conceptual space from the overking of the Aesir, Odin. In one sense, Mimir causes Heinir's invitation to counsel to be given to the people due to his absence. He causes Heinir to say, "Let others give counsel," due to being absent from his side. We might say Mimir was designed to be Heinir's attached advisor, and both to be with Odin in a perfect unity of sovereignty. But for some reason they have been split off from their home, and now Mimir is even apart from Heinir intermittently. This separation between them is noticed, and the noticing of this gap is the trigger that leads to doubt in Heinir's divine sovereignty. Mimir's absence causing doubt is technically what leads to his punishment, rather than to Heinir's punishment in the story. Because of this suspicious gap, instead of recognizing divine simplicity behind Heinir's words, the Vanir instead see the words of Heinir as a clue to Mimir's secret counsels, which are in breach of the terms of the hostage exchange. Remember that the problems for Diarmuid arise most prominently when he creates a sharp separation between himself and Finn, who is the parallel of Odin and also Heinir, by stealing away Finn's intended bride and having to run away from him. Indeed, Diarmuid does not arrive at the forest of Dubros, where the berries are kept, until he has separated himself from Finn. This suggests that the tantalizing offer to take the divine knowledge does not arise until separation from the king of the gods, and similarly, Heinir does not say, "Let others decide," until Mimir has been traded away from Odin in exchange for the god embodying the sacred liquid, Kvasir, and then becomes separated from Heinir's side as well. Mimir's beheading, then, may partially parallel the origin of death stories because it is the moment the kingship of the gods, represented here by Heinir as the tranquil Shiva-type face of Odin, is perceived through the lens of ambiguity due to perceived separation. Why should Heinir ever be doubted to be wise? He is an aspect of Odin and shapes the world with him, giving one of the three gifts of life to humans. Heinir, very specifically, is the one who is said to give Other, reason or mind, to the first humans, Asker and Embla. Thus, being a thoughtless puppet in this story should be a strong clue to look deeper. Heinir is the one being in the whole universe said to wield the prophetic divining rod after Ragnarok in Völuspá 63. The prophet of the gods is not someone who is unable to give pronouncements or to see things wisely. Something else more cryptic is going on here. If Heinir is the passive and peaceful Shiva-type aspect of Odin, who is the highest god, then he is the face of the tranquility of the high sovereign of the universe. In this, he is like a vacuum of pure grace that either does not need to choose, is so peaceful that it is not in its nature to choose, or is so divided from itself in this moment that it has been frozen into indecision. The reason for Mimir's punishment is then his absence from Heinir's side and the misrepresenting of his role in Heinir's speech. By being away from Heinir's side, and both of them from Odin's side, for that matter, Mimir allows the king to be questioned. When Heinir is forced to speak without Mimir, his mantra, "Let others give counsel," is interpreted within a now ambiguous state of things. The perspective on Heinir's sovereignty has been pulled out of joint. This pronouncement, "Let others give counsel," may be a more multi-layered thing than it at first appears. In one sense, it acts like a Norse fruit of knowledge, or at least the state after the fruit of knowledge, an opening for outside thinking in the matter of divinely sovereign things hanging suggestively in the air, creating ambiguity. It is simultaneously an invitation for decision, let others advise the king, a mantra of serenity beyond such decisions, and the introduction of a suspicious contingency or indecision that suggests internal division in the kingship. Mimir is punished in part because his distance from the king causes a leak of sovereignty, a continuing theme of Yima and Diarmuid throughout their stories. The words that Mimir does give to Heinir appear deceptive in contrast to the times when he is not present to give them, making his crime also one of speech that is partly false, consistent with his parallels. Rather than being simply integrated with Heinir as his functioning advisor, Mimir's words now have the character of deceptions, and deceptive words precisely on the topic of the decisions of the divine sovereign. Via this process of absence and then outside counsel, he has allowed the simplicity of the divine sovereign to be replaced by doubt. As Uparicara is faced with a decision and tries to favor the gods, but it only reveals the gap between his own words and cosmic law, or at least what the rishis believe cosmic law to be, or how in another version he speaks too indifferently and thus passively, Heinir and Mimir's dynamic together in this story produces a similar situation. The gap between the supposed sovereign speech and the cosmic law comes into awareness and stands out insistently. This allows for the counterforce of death to strike as a corrective born of this ambiguity. Death must fill this gap. Heinir's "let others give counsel" seems to mark a state of being that comes about after the forbidden fruit is stolen and put into circulation. As Kvasir, the embodied sacred liquid equivalent to the soma, has been traded for Mimir, and Heinir has been put into circulation just before these events. Heinir's words mark a vacuum of decisiveness that Mimir, as the sometimes hubristic god of judgment, cannot resist filling. When Mimir fills that opening with his counsel, he identifies himself to the guardians of order that are poised to strike. When Mimir is there, the divine kingship appears unified. When Mimir is absent, the throne appears to be a hollow silence. This absence, combined with the misrepresentation of Heinir's speech as his own, is what triggers the doubt in the king and the identification of Mimir as the hidden advisor. Heinir's divine passivity becomes too much, turns into a parody of his natural peacefulness, and fails to uphold the front of unity that would have protected Mimir. Mimir is punished because his failure to remain integrated with the king allows the sovereign law to appear as a mere deceptive speech, while Heinir fails to cover over this internal division. In this, Mimir is a kind of scapegoat, caught in the tragic unfolding of a sequence of divisions and transfers. While the magical compulsion on Diarmuid that he must take Grainne away from Finn is what originally generates the separation of Diarmuid from Finn, Fohath Canainne's taboo of needing deadheads in order to drink in union with Finn is what generates the space of confusion in which the death of Fohath's sister and her husband can occur, with the permanent state of feud between Fohath and Finn that results therefrom, and the death of Fohath that follows. The division of Heinir and Mimir from Odin and the Aesir, which brings about their ambiguous situation, is caused by the Aesir-Vanir war, led by Freyr and Njordr against the Aesir. It is interesting, then, that the death of the steward's son happens at Angus's abode of Brunaboyne, setting off the Diarmuid saga, and that Angus intervenes to protect Diarmuid from Finn 2 or 3 times in the story. He is an important presence carrying through. Interestingly, this whole sequence also is connected to the organization of the sacrifice of the gods, because in the lines following Mimir's beheading, Snorri states that Freyr and Njordr are made priests of the sacrifice, and as mentioned, the embodiment of the sacred liquid, Kvasir, is the hostage exchanged for Mimir and Heinir. Kvasir is subsequently killed in a myth reminiscent of Dionysus Zagreus, until his blood, the meat of poetry, is stolen back and given to divine and mortal beings again. Thus, the beheading of Mimir connects immediately back to the Soma sacrifice theme. So why is the Shiva type here saying something triggering that results in the Yama type taking the fall and being killed for it? Why is what he says something specifically having to do with deciding on sovereign matters? As Gwyn's son is the catalyst in the Welsh version, as the nephews of Goll are in the Irish, does Heinir take the functionally equivalent position of the Shiva-type emanation serpent in the Norse story, the one who hangs the tempting offer of sovereign choice wrapped in death in the gap of ambiguity? In the Irish story, Finn wants some of the berries, as Heinir appears to want knowledge or counsel in his story, to essentially be asking for it as Finn is asking for the berries. The separation of Diarmuid and Mimir from Finn and Heinir, respectively, apparently leads even to the want of the high god for the substance of knowledge to be brought to him from outside, to reconnect the sacred knowledge to the king. Diarmuid and Mimir take up the task of providing those soma-like berries, or that knowledge which amounts to pronouncements on divinely sovereign things in the case of Mimir. This knowledge being brought from outside the king is what ultimately triggers the alarm bells, leading to the reaction of death upon the one who stood outside the king but provided the thing lacked, which only the king was supposed to have internally. Diarmuid provides the soma-like berries to the nephews of Goll and to Finn, as Mimir provides the soma-like knowledge to Heinir, and the scent on the berries that Diarmuid gives to Finn, which acts like Diarmuid's signature on the transferred thing, is what gives Diarmuid's secret location away and leads to his death. Meanwhile, the discrepancy between what Mimir gives Heinir and Heinir's own words, as if causing Mimir's signature on the pronouncements of Heinir to appear, gives Mimir's secret role away and leads to his death. It is true that Diarmuid and Mimir both nonetheless appear like scapegoats in their deaths. However, they also play their part in moving one tragic step to the next and acting from outside of the authority of the king, helping to produce the king's state of lack by their actions, while also acting to break certain ordinances, either against theft or against breach of laws of hostage exchange, honor codes, in one way or another. In this, Diarmuid and Mimir come to appear like representatives of the human ego consciousness as it individuates itself, becoming separated via a web of compulsions from unification with the divine king or the source. From that point, the gap of ambiguity leads to the questioning of the divine sovereign and triggers the sacred substance to appear outside of the domain of the king, then to be brought back to the king from the outside. But this individuation is also the signature, which is left on this transfer, and the whole thing amounts to a hubristic attempt to fulfill the deciding role for sovereignty by one who is outside of the sovereign state. Furthermore, zeroing in on these moments in the two stories brings into focus an even more precise alignment, which is a smoking gun for the parallel. When Finn scents Diarmuid's flesh on the berries, the nephews of Goll tell Finn that they themselves had killed the giant, and this is done on Diarmuid's request. This would get the nephews the credit and keep Diarmuid's exact location a secret. A strange behavior in this moment to do a deed and then give credit to another so that they represent themselves as having done it, with the ruse thereupon being found out. But this apparently is Diarmuid's general mode of action while he is hiding out in the forest at this point, as we see in the following scene. Finn, scenting the flesh of Diarmuid on the berries, deduces that he is at the quicken tree itself. He goes there himself, but when he arrives, Diarmuid has hidden himself and Grainne in the high and thick canopy, where the giant had laid out a bed for himself previously. Finn's own son is there, attempting to be a pacifying and even redirecting voice in Finn's ear all throughout. When Finn arrives at the foot of the quicken tree, Oisin, the son of Finn, tries to divert him, saying, "It is a great sign of envy in thee, O Finn, to suppose that Diarmuid would abide in the top of the quicken tree, and he knowing that thou art intent on slaying him." So Finn calls for a chessboard and asks Oisin to play him. As they are playing, Finn tells Oisin that there is one move that he can make to win the game, but he will not teach it to him. Grainne, high in the tree, demands that Diarmuid help Oisin with the move. So Diarmuid takes one of the forbidden berries themselves and throws it at the game board, thereby showing Oisin which man should be moved. They play 2 more times, and 2 more times Diarmuid throws a berry just in time to tell Oisin how to turn the game and beat Finn. At the end of this, Finn says something very telling. Quote, "I marvel not at thy winning that game, O Oisin, seeing that Oscar is doing his best for thee, and that thou hast with thee the zeal of Joring, the skilled knowledge of the son of Lugith, and the prompting of Diarmuid." Unquote. This is what finally triggers Diarmuid to reveal himself, while he also admits to having been Oisín's prompter in the game. Quote, "Thou didst never err in thy good judgment, O Finn," said Diarmuid, "and I indeed and Grainne are here in the bed of the Sharvan Lachlanach." Unquote. Diarmuid only dies much later in a separate hunt, but this is the moment when he is confronted by Finn and driven out of the safe haven forest with the youth-giving berries that would have kept him young and alive perpetually. Thus we have here a peacemaking emanation of Finn himself, his own son Oisín, who, while trying to make peace, becomes the vessel for actions prompted to him secretly by Diarmuid, all the while representing them as his own actions. Oisín, son of Finn, then must be in the role equivalent to Heinir, brother of Odin, for this particular moment, an expression of the high god's peace-seeking side. Oisín makes the moves on the game board that are prompted to him by the cunning Diarmuid, his secret advisor hidden in the canopy, just as Heinir gives the counsels that are prompted to him by the wise Mimir, his secret advisor behind the scenes. Seeing what has happened 3 times, Finn catches on that he is being deceived and that Diarmuid is the real mind behind the moves of Oisín. As the Vanir likewise catch on that they are being deceived and that Mimir is the real mind behind the counsels of Heinir. We can assert it very strongly now. This is the same motif recast in 2 separate contexts, 2 versions of one and the same plot beat being taken in different directions while retaining the core concept. Because this particular moment has the smoking gun details that so well align it with the Mimir and Heinir story, we can discard the previous comparison of the Mimir and Heinir story to the sequence involving the fruit brought to Finn by his nephews, if we wish. However, it appears plausible that the Norse story has radically compressed a myth that the Gaelic story has made elaborate and many-layered. And so one solution would be to consider that the 2 sections, the transfer of fruit to Finn by figures who claim they have retrieved them when Diarmuid really has, and the playing of chess against Finn by a figure who acts as though he is thinking up the moves when really Diarmuid is, can be treated as 2 layers of one continuous theme, which the Gaels thought had multiple interlocking parts, and the Norse took to be a single sequence between Heinir and Mimir. It cannot be lost sight of that the nephews of Goll are as though emanations of Goll, while Oisín is as though an emanation of Finn, and Finn and Goll are 2 faces of one god on the mythic level. This whole sequence is a play between aspects of the singular, complex Finn/Goll deity and his sub-aspects, enacting that god's dynamic interplay with the god represented by Diarmuid. Furthermore, it may not be insignificant that Diarmuid throws the forbidden berries of youth at the game pieces to communicate the moves, and so he is once again transmitting the forbidden fruit and his counsels to his frontman at the same time, vividly intertwining them. Remember also that Kvasir, the embodiment of the sacred liquid, is the hostage exchanged for Mimir and Heinir in their story, and setting up the drama that follows between them. And with the Gaelic parallel in place, it is hard not to take Kvasir as standing for the forbidden fruit that is passing between the heroes in the Gaelic story. In this way, the exchange of Kvasir to the Aesir has an arguably intentional mirroring effect with Mimir's secretly given counsels. Note also how Kvasir being exchanged to Odin and the Aesir for Heinir and Mimir is what puts Mimir in the position to need to secretly give his counsels to Heinir in the first place, while Diarmuid taking the berries and then giving them to the nephews of Goll to take to Finn is what triggers the need for Diarmuid to communicate the game moves to Oisín. The berries being brought to Finn is then like Kvasir being traded to Odin, and the subsequent berries thrown at the game board by Diarmuid are like the counsels secretly given to Heinir by Mimir. The need that is triggered by giving out the berries is apparently the need to tell the peacemaker the right moves in order to try to preserve a fragile or even crumbling peace. Diarmuid and Mimir know what moves to make in the divine game, but acting the role of outside chooser on such matters quickly identifies them, leaves their signature plain to see, reveals them where they are. In this, the Yama type is like the detached faculty of judgment, whether of an intellectual or more mnemonic type, based on memory, within the kingship of the gods. The moment the separation of the god of this faculty is fully seen through the berry-throwing or the inconsistent counsels of Heinir, he is marked for death as a separate center of judgment. Odin then attempts to reintegrate that center of judgment by embalming the head of Mimir with herbs so that he can consult it ever after, as Angus blows life breath into the dead body of Diarmuid to speak to it when he is in need. The fact that this is a complex drama internal to the Fianna warband, that is, internal to the Rudra Shiva or Finn Goll complex, is much more clearly played out in the Irish version, with the peaceful son Oisin directly confronting his destruction-bringing father, Finn, a face-off between the destroyer and peacebringer sides who have fallen into cross-purposes, while the nephews of Goll catalyze the initial fruit theft and its transfer, fulfilling another key role within the same extended Finn/Goll group. Though there are differences in presentation and even in the moral lesson conveyed between the Gaelic and Norse stories, we can now pinpoint the shared forbidden fruit motif in both, while musing on all the possible meanings. It is fascinating in this context to note that, while the Vedas do not have a clear parallel of this forbidden fruit story, they do have a cryptic description of Rudra giving a cup to his devotees, which makes them act on the same level with the gods. This drink is called Visha, and Jameson and Brereton agree that its description within the hymn, involving its churning, crushing, and ritual drinking, presents it as being the Soma sacrifice, or at least a mirror of the Soma sacrifice, an esoteric Soma. However, Visha means both water and poison, thus Rudra gives poison to drink, but this divine poison is like the dark side of the Soma, and the poison apparently grants enlightenment to those who are enlightened enough for it, causing them to be like gods, as the Genesis fruit promises to do. Rigveda 10.136, the hymn to the long-haired ascetic called the Keshin, reads, quote, "The long-haired one bears fire, the long-haired one poison, Visha. The long-haired one the two world halves. The long-haired one bears the sun for all to see. The long-haired one is called this light here. The wind-girt ascetics wear tawny rags. They follow the swooping of the wind when the gods have entered them. Roused up to ecstasy by our asceticism, we have mounted the winds. You mortals see only our bodies." He flies through the mid-space, gazing down on all forms. The ascetic has been established as the comrade of every god for good action, the horse of the wind, the comrade of Vayu. So sped by that god, the ascetic presides over both seas, the eastern and the western, ranging in the range of the Apsarasis and the Gandharvas. Of the wild birds, the long-haired one is their sweet, most exhilarating comrade, who knows their will. Vayu churned it for him. Kuna Nama kept crushing it, when the long-haired one drank of the poison with his cup, together with Rudra." Unquote. The Keshin, who has the Visha, knows the will of the gods, is their comrade, is entered by them, and flies around the skies with them. This may remind us of Yima and Vasu Uparicara flying to the heavens, but without their falls. This suggests the possibility that the separation of Diarmuid and his parallels from the sovereign, the gap of ambiguity which becomes the fallen state, is not the only possible outcome of the poisonous drink offer of the Rudra type in the Vedic mind. The fact that the drink offer is poison is not forgotten in the Vedic hymn, but it is clear that for them the state of separation from the king could somehow be overcome. The poison could be swallowed as Soma, as Shiva swallows the world poison and transmutes it, and the mystic could work side by side with the gods. A final intriguing Indian parallel can be mentioned for contemplation, not from the Vedic material, but from the oral traditions of southern India regarding Shiva and his son Kartikeya or Murugan. As noted, Shiva once gave the fruit of knowledge to his son Ganesha for winning a contest against his other son Kartikeya. Yet after leaving the region in sadness, Kartikeya learned that he himself was that fruit of knowledge. This parallels the salmon of knowledge Fintan caught by Finn and the cauldron of Awen tasted by Gwion, who then turns into a fish, as well as the heart of the dragon Fafnir, eaten by Sigurd. However, if Kartikeya, aka Murugan, is the fruit of knowledge, and he is the peacock-riding son of Shiva who seems to parallel the peacock angel of the Yazidis, the third-party tempter in their Adam and Eve variant, then it is interesting that Murugan is known for another story that involves him offering a woman fruit of enlightenment, or at least of ego puncturing. This is the story of the poet Avayar. While Avayar is a female instead of the usual male Yama type, there is reason to consider that she may still be downstream of a Yama-type mythos, possibly a historical female poet of the 12th century being mapped on to the Yama and Yima mythos in a process of hagiography. This possibility should be considered as one of the stories of Avayar tells that she was given a fruit of extended life, the Indian gooseberry, by a king. Quote, Adhi Yaman, who underwent hardship to find a special fruit that kept illness away and grew only once every 12 years. Because of his goodness, he wished to give the fruit to a deserving person rather than to eat it himself. He finally gave it to Avayar, deciding that her life best served humanity. Unquote. From Jasmine and Coconuts, South Indian Tales by Kathy Spagnoli, page 149 to 150. Avayar is thus the receiver of a berry of life/healing in different tellings, and she also is a renowned, world-excelling poet and wise woman, a philosopher and counselor to kings, in this way reminding both of Orpheus and the just discussed Mimir in her basic typology. While her reception of a berry of life and role as poet counselor cause us to look closer, she has an even more curious story about receiving fruit from a tricky deity in a tree. Murugan himself, son of Shiva, the Indian parallel of the third-party tempters found in our other parallels. Avayar, who also interestingly has left the company of a king who earnestly did not want her to leave his side, creating a gap of need in which the fruit story can occur, finds herself weak and starving upon the road. She sits beside a tree and there encounters a humble shepherd boy. She urgently asks for food. The shepherd boy offers to shake down a piece of fruit for her to sate her hunger. He asks if she wants cooked or cold fruit, roasted or unroasted. Due to the lack of a standardized scholarly version of this local tradition, I will note that two versions at least appear to exist. One in which she asks for the hot or roasted fruit, the other where she asks for the cold or unroasted fruit. See Tales of Avayar, edited by Anant Pai. In the version where she asks for the hot, she believes the boy is talking nonsense, and she is only humoring him. In the version where she chooses unroasted or cold, it is because she believes hot or roasted fruit from a tree is not a real thing. When the boy shakes down a fruit, she picks it up and has to blow the sand off of it. As she is doing so, the boy playfully asks her if the fruit is so hot that she must blow it off. There is a pun here, as the word sutta, S-U-T-T-A, has two meanings in Tamil, hot and roasted. Thus she realizes that while she believed the roasted fruit direct from the tree was an impossible category, the boy caught her acting out the same action as if the fruit was hot or roasted, thus underlining a verbal pun that makes hot and roasted the same thing and makes blowing off sand the same act as blowing off hot food. Some of the nuance of exactly what the wordplay is doing here is surely being lost in translation, but regardless, she is struck in a moment of ego rupture. She, a renowned philosopher, scholar, and poet, undefeated master of language and logic, has been caught off guard by a wordplay that has made her act out what had seemed a moment before a logically contradictory category, and has also caught her in a moment of intellectual hubris, thinking this impossible before. She admits defeat to the boy and realizes he is the divine Murugan. Many differences exist between this story and that of the other forbidden food stories, but a few things stand out. First, of course, is Murugan himself, in his expected role as tricky offerer of fruit, and specifically offering this fruit to a woman who is in a particular state of need for the fruit, who again has separated herself from the presence of the king. This offer also involves a binary choice, hot or cold, roasted or unroasted. This recalls the fact that the fruit of Genesis is fruit of knowledge of good and evil, the binary of all values. We should also recall that Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his seminal work, The Raw and the Cooked, focuses on the way in which the binary of the raw and the cooked structured certain tribal societies in terms of nature and culture, and the categories of social activity and values that arise from this binary. The raw passes on to the cooked, as natural humans pass on to cultured humans, which is the very theme often read into the story of Adam and Eve, the gaining of social existence after passing out of the state of nature and innocence, and the binary between them being established as the foundation of future linguistic and social structures. So in this sense, Murugan is offering Avayar a choice centered on the fundamental binary at the root of human society and language, by subverting what she thinks are firm logical categories with a play on words, suggesting that the roasted and the unroasted are linguistic categories that can be undone linguistically as well. He deconstructs this firm foundation of hers in a way that shocks her ego confidence. He reveals the unstableness of verbal categories that she relies on, and so reveals the unstableness of her perception of reality as categorized into clear dualities. He uses her own embodied act to move the fruit from the expected category to its opposite. In some ways, the punchline of the story then reminds us of Zen stories, or of paradoxes of the philosopher Zeno, or the like, which force the breakdown of our stable framework of linguistically bounded categories so that something beyond dualism leaves a momentary impression. The framing of the story, where an elevated Yama-type sage is given a choice between two foods, and the decision hinges on a wordplay that ultimately makes the words of the sage false, leading to the sage's humbling fall, reminds us of the story of Vasu Uparicara, whose fall occurred when he was given the choice between the unborn plant sacrifice and goat sacrifice, and proclaimed goat sacrifice to be acceptable due to goat and unborn being homophones, both Aja. We should also note how Finn, Gwion, and Sigurd's moments of enlightenment involve them burning their fingers on the hot food of knowledge and placing their fingers in their mouths. This is different from blowing on the food, but is a similar category of act, a common reflex to heat or dust on food. While those figures are enlightened with knowledge, Avayar is taught something deep about language and reality and their unstableness, but she does not necessarily reach enlightenment in the same way they do. The fruit is not shown to give her more than this lesson, which ultimately is a lesson that humbles her, causes her to admit defeat rather than triumph. In this sense, the ending of the story aligns somewhat with the downbeat end to the stories of the Diarmuid and Adam type. But it also suggests the possibility of a lesson of non-dualism hiding behind the smirk of Murugan, as Heinir's words may similarly be read as a wink from the incomprehensible placidity of the Godhead that is beyond mere choices between binaries. Remember that even Murugan himself is downcast when he loses the fruit of knowledge to his brother Ganesha, until he has the realization of his own direct identity with that fruit. Murugan and Ganesha then are examples of beings who transcend their separation from the divine king via a path of direct gnosis and unification with that king. The tree of life in Eden takes a secondary role to that of knowledge of good and evil, but it is also pivotal. It appears that the Iranic tree of the white hauma cannot be the parallel of the mere tree of life, as the hauma comes from the Indo-European drink of divine knowledge as well as of immortality. The plant of enlightenment is the plant of immortality. The tree of life is what is given as free gift of grace by Yahweh, as long as trust is not broken in Eden. It implies the perpetual life that exists as the standard within that pre-fall state, and in this way it is similar to the tree of all seeds that freely gives worldly sustenance and healing. The berries of the quicken tree of Dubros, on the other hand, are much like the soma/hauma in their special and uniquely vivifying quality, and are not equatable to the background grace of Finn or the free hunting allowed in the forest, but stand out as something more than the freely granted life only once the gap of separation from Finn has come into awareness. The berries, like the Vedic soma, are something special. They are defined within their context as being an excess. So in this way, even though the tree of knowledge primarily appears to be based on the Iranic Halma tree, which comes from the Indo-European tree of enlightenment and gets bound up with sin-inducing meat sacrifice in Indo-Iranic traditions, there can still be the separate tree of life that Yahweh says will make Adam and Eve live perpetually if they eat it alongside the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. What Yahweh's concern seems to mean is that if Yahweh continues to give his standard grace of divine sustenance, Adam and Eve will continue to live indefinitely, along with their now specially immortalized minds. The Genesis tree of knowledge gives them an awareness or even an experience of eternity, but it does not make them live perpetually like the sustenance of the tree of life does. Yahweh's comment about the tree of life giving continued life aligns with the general removal of divine protection and eviction from the protected forest that we see in Diarmuid and Grainne's story. Fundamentally, though, the concepts of life and immortal life that are implied even in the two Iranic trees, the tree of all seeds and the tree of white halma, are not easily divided into a clean binary of knowledge and life. They intertwine. The tree of all seeds also offers healing and sustaining powers from its plants. Immortality and knowledge are both combined in the Halma tree, and it is possible to wonder if the two trees are as though branches of one higher tree. It is even more believable that the Genesis authors took the concepts from the Iranic source and made the binary a bit cleaner to meet their own narrative purpose. In so doing, the boiling down of the transcendent knowledge mixed with immortality provided by the Halma, along with the concerns about judging, speaking, or sacrificing falsely that we see in the Indo-Iranic Comparanda, to a cryptically flat concept of knowledge of good and evil, appears to have given us the moral framing for the biblical original sin that has shaped much of the world since. Perhaps the knowledge of good and evil for the Genesis authors implied understanding the paradox of their single source, as Isaiah 45:7 has Yahweh proclaiming, quote, I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. Unquote. The word for woe in this verse, Ra, is the same word, Ra, used in Genesis for the evil in the tree of knowledge of good and evil, suggesting that this woe or evil, though we find it in a binary in the world when separated from Yahweh, comes from the Lord who does all things, at least in certain parts of the Hebrew Bible. It would be fair to observe that this sharper binary between good and evil in itself suggests something like what we see in Zoroastrianism, and so could suggest a source that was already moving in a black and white, morally dualistic direction. But the Vedic and so presumably pre-Zoroastrian Iranic religions were already deeply moralistic in their own ways. The fact that we are confronted with a tree of knowledge of good and evil rather than of truth and the lie, the signature terms of the Zoroastrian moral dualism, is another point toward a non-Zoroastrian origin for the moral framework in question. As scholar Shal Shaked argues, quote, the question as to the dualistic consciousness of the Zoroastrians is not identical with the question as to how we ought to describe the religion of Zoroaster. The religious message of Zoroaster is without hesitation a dualism, for it is founded on the existence of two antagonistic powers. It may, however, be argued that there is no attestation of a declared dualistic stand before the Sasanian period. Even in the inscriptions of the early Sasanians, we have no clear reference to a definition of the religion of the king and the state as a system of faith which is based on the clash between two cosmic powers. Only in the Videvdat and in the Pahlavi writings is a clear dualist ideology expressed, with the Mazdaean religion defined as standing against that of the Devs. Yet even in the Pahlavi books, it is not always predominant. It is possible to assume that the proud declaration of Zoroastrianism as a dualistic faith and the assertion that dualism is the only satisfactory form of religion may have come about at the end of a long period of contacts and polemics with Jews and later with Christians, and under the impetus of rivalry with other dualistic ideologies such as Manichaeism. Unquote. From Shal Shaked, Dualism in Transformation. Shaked also notes the incompleteness of the dualism of good and evil even in Zoroastrianism itself. Quote, "Despite the effort at making a neat distinction between good and evil, a certain ambiguity in the character and function of the chief protagonists cannot entirely be avoided. We have a number of indications for ethical and ontological ambiguities that spoil the absolute separation of good and evil. To give just a few examples, death is a creation of Ahriman, but it is said to carry advantages within it. Sexual desire is instilled in men as a sinister corruption devised by Ahriman, but the whole scheme of the world is based on the benefits accruing from that to mankind and to the creation of Ormazd. The myth of creation is based on an implicit assumption that the devil, Ahriman, is true to his word. Once he has concluded an agreement with Ormazd, he is incapable of breaking it. This is a necessary element of the story, but is out of character. There is a range of ambivalent figures in Zoroastrian mythology which break the clear-cut division between the two camps. It appears that some prominent members of the pantheon have a sinister aspect to their person. This is apparent, for example, in the figures of Yima or Karasaspa, not to speak of a divine figure like Vayu or Y, which occupies an ambiguous position between the two powers and had to be split into two in order to preserve the dualistic structure without allowing it to be strained beyond what it can take." Unquote. From Shaked, Dualism in Transition 23-24. Therefore, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil does suggest a somewhat morally dualistic framing akin to the Iranic-related trends that produced Zoroastrianism. But the mere existence of a division between good and evil in this story type does not give us warrant to say that it must have been from a post-Zoroastrian source. All this being said, the intense ongoing dialogue between Iran and Israel that this and other evidence demonstrates tells us that a partially Zoroastrian influence framework could also have been the source, or a pre-Zoroastrian version of Yima's story with a partial application of later Zoroastrian moral frameworks applied. Ultimately, the final moral framing in Genesis is the work of the Hebrew adapters themselves, taking influence from the Iranic and other philosophical currents to settle on the moral foundation that they chose to lay down for their people. It is interesting that the Gaelic Parhalon is the one blamed in his version of the story, rather than his wife and her lover, showing that this version took the angle that the sin was ultimately a failure of the sovereignty, of the sovereign. This in itself suggests a non-dual moral, where the sin comes from the king of the gods, Parhalon being his representative, as both good and evil come from Yahweh, and we are intended to see that divine sovereign principle represented by Parhalon within ourselves, because we are supposed to be able to take the lesson that it is always the responsibility of the sovereign to protect from the splitting up and disintegration of the sovereignty. So, is the serpent of the Adam and Eve story based on a demonic, satanic figure, or a divine one, or only on a mere animal? As we can now see, the answer depends on whether the adaptation, the authorship of the Genesis story, based in part on the Iranic material, was based on a fully pre-Zoroastrian version of the Yima story or not. And as we can see, this was an adaptation rather than a native Hebrew story. And it depends on what attitude the adapters had toward the serpent figure they were creating in the adaptation. The majority of the evidence we have reviewed points to an essentially pre-Zoroastrian Iranic source, even if a partially Zoroastrian source has to be kept in consideration due to the dualism and other things we've discussed. And this suggests that the Genesis serpent was based on a model of the son or emanation of Shiva type, and was at that point undemonized. In terms of how the serpent appears within the Genesis story, nothing clearly marks him as being of overt evil, like Azzi-Dahaka has become in the Yima story, who consumes human brains and is identified as an emissary of the straightforwardly demonized Ahriman. The Genesis serpent is much more unmarked than the obviously demonic Azzi-Dahaka. The serpent is a trickster, yes. He represents danger, indeed. And he is the third party that tempts the couple into the act of theft that leads eventually to their deaths. But all of these things are already true of the nephews of Goll, or of the serpent who kills Eurydice. Finn and Goll themselves and the Vedic Rudra are already lords of trickery and even lies, bringers of destruction and death when that is their divine role to play. None of these things mark these deities as demons, and so none of them establish the serpent as a demon either. Nonetheless, when the dangerous and tricky pre-Zoroastrian serpent was used as the model of the Genesis serpent, he was brought into a monolatrous, monotheizing context that caused his role to become extremely ambiguous. To maintain the role of the serpent, he had to be acting separately from Yahweh in the story. It appears that in the source, the Iranic serpent would have been a direct emissary of the God that ultimately catches the couple who steals the fruit, as Yazidi still was the direct emissary of Ahriman in the later reformed and demonized version, Ahriman being based originally on the Rudra Shiva type high god. The serpent would have been a direct emissary of Yahweh then, in a direct adaptation into a Hebrew context. But such a role is more difficult to pin down in the context of the Bible. The serpent could not so easily be a direct extension or emanation of Yahweh, as a pagan Israelite version would likely have made him. Yet if he is completely separated from the high god, then he does begin to appear more like an independently maleficent entity, working for his own ends. Yazidi and the nephews of Goll are not working for their own ends. They are carrying out the wishes of the high god, who is himself very wily and at times deceiving, eventually catching the couple on the orders of that very same high god. The link between the serpent of Genesis and Yahweh, then, has been left out, leaving it unclear if he is being tricky for his own ends or in the employ of a higher being. The Yazidis use the terminology of the angel for their Adam and Eve tempter. He is the angel of the even higher absolute God. And so this could function as a good label for what the Iranic source theory implies the serpent to have been originally, something like an angel. Those who argue that the serpent is being presented in Genesis as a member of Yahweh's divine council or one of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of El, appear then to be close to the truth if we stick to Semitic terminology for what is an Iranic adaptation. Yet, by what has been unstated, the serpent has been cut off from his divine overgod more than the peacock angel is, left to drift in an eternally ambiguous status in the final Genesis story, eventually allowing him to be simplified and drawn under the umbrella of Satan or the devil, possibly as a result of trends similar to those that affected the Iranic source material. What was left out of the serpent's story, his original status, became the gap that allowed a flattening darkness to obscure ever after the fact that he was originally doing the bidding of the wily high god. Finally, the supposed lie of Yahweh that Adam and Eve will die in the day that they eat the fruit can be explained in theory by reference to the Irish story. In that story, the divine being who tells the couple that they will be in trouble if they take the berries, the Tuatha giant Sharvan Lachlanach, is separate from the divine being who catches the couple when they subsequently take the berries. The giant who owns the berries is even in a feud with Finn, the god who catches the couple after, and this feud is the reason that Diarmuid is allowed to hunt in the forest and that Finn needs to trick Diarmuid to get the berries for him. The reason Diarmuid is told he will be risking death if he meddles with the berries is that Sharvan Lachlanach appears to be an unbeatable giant, one who will be in danger of killing whoever tries to take them, there and then. Right when Diarmuid is being compelled by his wife and the nephews of Goll to go and take the berries from the giant, he proclaims the immediate death the giant threatens. Quote, "Were ye to see one glimpse of the giant, ye would more than likely die than live after it." Unquote. Based on what we have seen, there is a strong argument to be made that a similar proclamation could have attended the taking of the fruit in the lost Iranic source story, immediate death threatened by the guardian of the fruit rather than the pursuing high god, and these roles were muddled together in the adaptation. Indeed, several lines in the story highlight the possibility that trying to take the berries will mean immediate death. Quote, "Nothing is more difficult for you to get than that, the berries," unquote, says Oshin. The giant is one, quote, whom neither weapons wounds, nor fire burns, nor water drowns, so great is his magic, unquote. One of the nephews of Goll says that he would, quote, rather perish in seeking those berries than go back again to his mother's country, unquote. Finally, Diarmuid implores, quote, force me not to break peace with the Sharvan Lachlanach, for he would not the more readily let me take them, unquote, and concludes with the aforesaid, quote, ye shall not come with me, for were ye to see one glimpse of the giant, ye would more likely die than live after it, unquote. Diarmuid overcomes this danger, however, defeating the giant and gaining the berries, making the claim that any attempted theft of the berries means immediate death, a mere overstatement based on the perceived danger. It could be postulated that the author of the adaptation to Genesis wanted to keep in the death-threatening quality of the berry theft, that plot beat, but removed the actual guardian in the process of simplification, rendering the danger unclear. After Diarmuid takes the berries, Finn catches the couple, and although his anger at first threatens their lives, he is partly pacified and instead drives them out of the forest, makes a temporary truce with them, and only significantly later allows Diarmuid to die due to his grudge. It is notable, however, that in some versions of Yima's story he is cut in half in the very tree in which he is found, the moment that would be comparable to when Finn finds Diarmuid in the tree just after he has taken the berries. Mimir is also beheaded immediately after being discovered as the man behind the decisions of Heinir. So while there is a possibility that an Iranic source had a more immediate death for Yima, this jars somewhat with the eviction shared between the Diarmuid story and that of Genesis. Whatever the complex details were in the original Iranic story, these were adapted into the short, monotheizing narrative of Genesis, where the deity who threatens death for eating the berries and the one who catches the thieves, evicts them, and leads them to their deaths are suddenly one and the same deity. A conflation has apparently occurred, since there appears to be guardians of the white halma-tree, the car fish, in the surviving Iranic material. Thus, the removal of the guardian, who may have become the guardian angel who is installed after Adam and Eve leave the place. As in other cases of the Indo-Iranic adaptation, it appears plausible that the pressure of boiling conflicting characters down into one coherent story could have led to this moment of Yahweh's contradiction between his threatened punishment and the one he actually delivers, death immediately versus death much later, the back and forth inner conflict of the god found in the source, alternating between anger and mercy, if Finn's narrative is anything to go by, could also have provided context for this particular inconsistency. Finn is demanding immediate satisfaction for Diarmuid at first, and is only pacified gradually by his family members, who themselves represent internal conflicts within the warband, and then peace agreements and the impressive fighting of Diarmuid that contributes to Finn relenting. If any of this complexity was struck by the eraser of the adapter, it could have left behind the contradictoriness of Yahweh's threats without the inner turmoil and plot elaborations that would have explained the high god's threats in the Iranic original. Similar to the serpent, Tawusi Malik also says things will go well if Adam and Eve eat after God had said it would not. But in this story, God has made the law against eating the plant, but after a long period, Tawusi Malik asks God what is going on with Adam and the prospect of his future offspring. God had originally wanted Adam to have many offspring, as the text states. So God puts the whole issue in Tawusi Malik's hands, and that is when Tawusi Malik tells Adam things will go well for him if he eats the previously forbidden plant. Quote, "Have you eaten wheat?" he says. "No, because God forbade me." He said to him, "Eat of it. Things will prove better than they are now." So he ate, and after he did eat, Tawusi Malik caused his belly to become swollen. He put him out of paradise, left him alone, and went up to heaven. Unquote. We can see that there is more of a logical chain here regarding why there is a shift from the prohibition on the plant to the tempter telling Adam it will be good if he eats it, and the lack of immediate death for doing so. God changes his stance somewhat in this case. First, he prohibits the plant, but after a long time, he appears to allow Tawusi Malik to direct Adam to it in order to fix the situation regarding the lack of offspring. This is further interesting because Vedic Yama's relinquishing of immortality is directly and specifically done so that he can father children. A similar motivation seems to be revealed in this Yazidi story, but on the part of God and Tawusi Malik themselves, who, desiring to cause Adam to have children, direct him to the forbidden food. Thus, something like this could have been in the Iranic version of the story used by the Genesis authors. God may originally have more clearly switched from threatening death for taking the fruit to not enforcing that threat as directly after some time had passed and other events had changed his mind somewhat. It is fascinating how little the God-equivalent figure in each of the stories we have that touch on this point, the Yazidi and the Gaelic, actually care about the eating of the forbidden food when it happens. They are depicted as having other things on their minds, other plans that they are following along, and the eating of the food is just a tool used to cause the eater of the food to have to leave the inertia of the paradisal garden so that the high god can either exact a different debt from him or make him have offspring. It is hard not to think that shaving some of this away may have contributed to the contradictory moments in Genesis 2-3 to some degree. Please check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel and see all of the important topics I have in mind get made into videos, as well as supporting the completion of my second book, Briochan's Tower, in which many mysteries will be solved. My book, Taliesin's Map, is available from Amazon. Link in the description.